It's a great pleasure for me to wish you all welcome to Sápmi, the traditional Sami area. The theme for the conference is Moving North. In Sami language we would say Johti Taavas.
So, good morning, everyone. I'm also going to welcome you at this first session that we have today. We have what I think a very interesting session together, very interdisciplinary, different stakeholders and sectors involved, on adaptive management of the Arctic under a changing climate. And the title is quite long. I think it also says using interdisciplinary and system science approaches. So it's quite a big topic we're covering here today. I'm going to keep it very short, the introduction, because we have a very tight schedule, actually. I just want to welcome you all. I also want to give some pointers to the speakers. So all the speakers are invited to stand here at the table. We have a microphone at the table, so try to stay close to that one. Feel free to get some water if you want. Cecilia here, one of the organizing committee members as well, will be a little bit of the devil today. She will be the person saying if you have 2 minutes left or 0 minutes left for your talk. Don't take that very bad or wrongly. It's a very tight schedule and we want to give everyone the chance to speak. And also we're streaming online, so people are moving in and out to see talks, so it's very important that we try to stay a little bit on schedule here. At the same time, I also really want to thank the whole organizing committee of this session. So as I already said, it's Cecilia van Quilleveld from Norwegian Polar Institute. Also here in the front, we have Niels Martin Schmidt from OS University. I'm not sure if the other co-hosts are in the room, but we also have Raul Pimisierio from University of Tromsø that I would like to thank. And the last person who was really helping putting this together was Dr. Gary Griffiths, who's right now sleeping almost because he's in New Zealand. Other than that, I hope you enjoy yourself. If there's any question, any issue, please ask technical people if there's something, or come to me personally if there's an issue or something you have a question about. With that, I want to introduce our first speaker, which is Griffin Hill from Noor University, and he will give this opening talk for this conference, for this session at least. All right, thank you.
Oh yeah, that's much better. All right, so I'm Griffin, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about climate analogs as a part of our adaptation toolkit. So we can't talk about a toolkit without talking about the right tool for the job and how we've gotten to the tools that we have here in the first place. Studies, these are very foundational to a lot of what we know today. Going out into different systems, whether it be the intertidal or reef flat, and observing over time. Some of these transects now have been observed with data collected for decades. And so this was a really kind of powerful first step in understanding better our systems. From there, we moved on to more manipulative studies, experiments, taking individual organisms or part of these systems and manipulating them in some way to address even more sophisticated and complex research question. And so you may be wondering, where do models come into all this? And as the scope of our observation has changed to observing systems of systems, so too do our tools need to adapt with it. And climate change is one such issue that really acts on this scale of systems. And individual observation campaigns simply cannot reach that massive scope. However, while this scale presents certain difficulties, it also presents real opportunities in that we can highlight areas or countries likely, on a whole global scale, likely to experience the greatest opportunities and challenges related to climate change. So what are climate analogs at the end of the day? Analogous climates are highly similar climates, but separated by time, space, or both. And we can use these to address very large but very simple questions, such as how might a given place, industry, change in the future. And this is a tool that already exists in the terrestrial realm. This specific one is from Copernicus, which is the European satellite network. So here we are in Tromsø, so we have to ask, how will Tromsø change in the future? And this, through this tool, you're able to select different parameters, different climate change scenarios, the time scale that you're interested in. This one is for 2070. And you can see that what it returns is that the Tromsø area may end up looking more like Orkanger in Trondelag. And while this doesn't mean that we'll all end up speaking Trondish by 2070, it does mean that our experience of the climate, how much precipitation, the average temperature, the number of these tropical warm nights we may have. And this is something that people can relate to very directly. And as a result, I think it is something that's been picked up in popular news media as well, as specific areas and industries are highlighted as changing or being forecast to change greatly, such as the disruption of, or the anticipated disruption of winemaking in places with centuries-old traditions. And this is a big deal if you come from a winemaking area like I do in California. But it's also a big deal if you're in one of these areas that is anticipated to inherit these highly productive conditions. I think this article was highlighting the Netherlands, for example. So we can't talk about climate analogs without talking about climate and how we define climate. So when developing a climate analog, the climate is defined with respect to the research question, with a species or a group of species of greatest interest. So we are in Norway after all, and my PhD is focused on aquaculture in a changing climate. So we'll take the Atlantic salmon, specifically the aquaculture of Atlantic salmon. And so this will determine how we define our climate. In this example, dissolved oxygen, salinity, temperature will definitely be major drivers of the experience and the productivity of salmon. If this was, if we were looking at wild populations, perhaps primary productivity as the basis of kind of all the carbon in the food chain would be a major concern. And this will change greatly depending on the species or group of species we're interested in. So once we have that nailed down, we move back to this idea of an analogous climate separated by time or space. And as we're identifying these climates, we can look at the distance and the time that the shift is likely to occur over to generate a metric of climate velocity. And studies have shown that when experiencing climate change, when it comes to industries or wild populations, it's often the rate of change that is the greatest determinant of the outcome rather than the absolute change. So this is another metric that we generate in the process that can say something about what is likely to occur. And digging a bit into the technical side of how this actually works, we can break kind of the whole world into grid squares of climate analogs. We can select one, for example, end of century climate that we're interested in. Going back to this Tromsø example, we asked what might Tromsø look like at the end of the century. And then we compare it in the space that, like you see in this figure, that is determined not by geography. The axes have nothing to do with geography, but instead by climate parameters, in this case precipitation and temperature. But in reality, it will be many more than 2 parameters, which becomes hard to visualize once you get past 3-dimension, but you end up with an n-dimensional climate space where your climate of interest will be most proximate to its analog, even if geographically they're on other sides of the world. And of course, we can do this in both directions. We can take an area of interest and its climate at the end of the century and ask what its current analog is, but we can also take the current climate in a place and ask where it is likely to end up at the end of the century. So this is very flexible and adaptive, as will continue to be a theme, depending on the research question or the scale of implementation. And one of the things that sets climate analogs apart from many of the other existing tools we have already in our adaptation toolkit is that there's no occurrence data or biodiversity data required. If we have information about the range maps of species, or we have a really good occurrence database, this can of course be included. But for many non-model species that haven't been as intensively studied, for example, like many algae species, one of the biggest challenges in even starting a modeling exercise is curation of these massive data sets. So this is an example from one of my co-supervisors of what goes into just trying to get a workable data set for a brown algae, for example, where all of the red points were kept in the data set, and then all the darker points were stripped out through this cleaning process. And this is true for any number of non-model species. And so you start with a research question, but before you're able to generate even kind of a preliminary results or inkling of where your results may be going, for many species or groups of species, there is this massive resource-intensive curation process that needs to occur. And this is getting better all the time as our databases, as people take on this task, but there's also more data being added all the time that needs to be curated. So I see this as a major advantage of climate analogs, is that you can get at least something going and start seeing results without necessarily needing a very refined biodiversity data set. So speaking of results, this is just the beginning of my PhD, looking at metrics of climate dissimilarity, which is kind of an intermediate metric before generating actual analogs. Up above, so this is once again Atlantic salmon, and these are two different climate change scenarios. So the shared socioeconomic pathways, what SSP stands for, 1-1.9, which roughly corresponds to the Paris Agreement. And then we have SSP 5-8.5, which is more on par with continued fossil fuel development. And so we can see even in these scenarios, which are admittedly kind of at either end of the spectrum of possibility, some things emerge right away. One is the strength of the Paris Agreement. You go from anticipating highly dissimilar climates over basically the whole modeling area under fossil fuel development scenario to much nicer, kind of a green picture over the more moderate scenario as the climate change is mitigated across the variables selected. You also see the beginnings of an emergence of relative resilience as you move poleward, with pockets of green and much less dissimilarity in the higher latitudes, including in the Arctic, even under this extreme climate change scenario. And this is borne out even more as we look at analogs themselves and what this could look like. This is another figure from this first paper that we published kind of as an introduction to the power of climate analogs, where you can see in a hypothetical scenario, and as we saw with the running on land, this scenario with Tromsø, is that, for example, you have this poleward shift of many climates, with perhaps the middle of Norway looking more like the south and the north looking more like the middle. And for industries, once again, my focus in my PhD is aquaculture. This can mean a few different things. Going back to salmon, this could be the optimal production area could be moving into the Arctic or deeper into the Arctic. Whereas in southern Norway or southern countries, this could be moving further from the optimum. So depending on where you are, this tool gives both, can give predictions of areas most in need of mitigation activity. So perhaps in parts of Norway, salmon won't be the most productive or profitable cultivar, and instead you'll shift species, or you'll add technology such as the emerging prominence of recirculating aquaculture systems to mitigate. But in other areas, it will highlight opportunities, areas that aren't very developed in a given industry, such as aquaculture, that may be inheriting a climate that is very suitable for this pursuit. and may, given enough lead time, be able to capitalize on this. And the Arctic is kind of the perfect place to look at all this, because not only can we look at the direct effects, these changes in temperature, salinity, or the shared climate picture, but also the impacts on production and industry. It's really where the rubber meets the road on all this. It's where the rapid direct climate change impacts meet complex governance and a diverse body of stakeholders. And this is where climate analogs can, in combination with other tools, make a huge impact. And so I've talked a bit about the role in management and flexibility and working on different scales, and so I want to give a bit of an example of what that can look like. So this is what one layer of the model, or one layer of the input data to the model could look like. This is sea surface temperature. And at this high view, it looks very uniform and quite pretty. And if we zoom in a bit, this is what the model really sees. And so at this point, you can see that it's not a uniform picture, but it's made up of tiny grid squares or pixels. These are 5 arc-minute grids, which is about 10 square kilometers at the equator. So this is about as fine as the model can go, which is pretty good when we're working on the whole Earth. But we can also aggregate these pixels into any scale or unit or area that is meaningful from a management or governance context. So this may be how the model sees Oslo in the Oslo fjord, but we can aggregate it up to something more meaningful, like exclusive economic zones are a common starting point. This is one of the main base units of governance. This is where governing bodies want to know, okay, what will happen in our waters? How will things change? How dissimilar are things likely to be? Or what conditions will we most be like in the future? But for other questions, marine ecoregions, areas that don't care as much about geopolitical boundaries, but more about shared ecosystems and conditions. Because if these are shifting, this could guide, huge population shifts of a given species that really tracks that ecosystem. Or for other types of questions, perhaps it's just we want to divide the world up completely equally and look at a grid that is more operable than 10 kilometers, but for something like marine protected area implementation, maybe we're not as interested in borders, but just a certain size of area that we would consider protecting. And beyond management and policy, I think this tool is really powerful because it produces, from even the early stages, news you can use. This is a great science communication tool whose results don't require a doctorate to interpret. And it's relatable to the public. You can imagine the contribution to conversations, or I'm sure you've all had conversations before with people who talk about how their hometown feels different. It doesn't snow as much, or the summers are warmer. And this is a conversation that the results from this type of modeling tie into really, really thoroughly. And there are all different types of tools that you can make. Currently in the terrestrial realm, there's everything from predicting at the scale of even within cities where which neighborhood will inherit the climate conditions of another, which I think is perhaps a bit fine, but up to the whole world, like the types of results I'm showing here. And so this is something that I think has a lot of utility for people all the way up from public, lay people in popular news media like we saw, to managers, conservationists, and industry experts that are planning kind of the next generation of activity. And so what is the next step in all this? For me, continuing with my PhD, we are looking at developing these analogs for over 150 aquaculture species, which we've carried out literature review to identify the most relevant climate parameters to create these analogs. And then we'll group along groups that are meaningful to aquaculture, such as finfish and algae. we'll develop this type of visualization and the actual distance to the nearest analog and the directionality as well, looking to develop metrics such as in an EEZ, what percent of it would be inheriting a climate from another given EEZ to kind of give an idea that Norway will be 50% more like this place or that place. And kind of the final, what this could look like at the end is taking a relevant management unit, whether it be exclusive economic zones or anything down from there, and ranking them based on suitability or change in suitability to highlight both areas with perhaps opportunities to capitalize on changes and increases in suitability, as well as areas that may need to prioritize mitigation now in preparation for changes that will affect an industry in the future. So thank you very much to my co-authors who contributed to this, and to you all for listening. I hope I've demonstrated the potential of climate analogs as a tool in the ongoing adaptive management of our ever-changing Arctic. Do we have time for any questions?
No, that we don't, because we have a very tight schedule.
All right,
But thank you so much.
I have a digital booth online where you can find me, and I'll also be around, of course, through the whole conference.
That's perfect. Thanks so much, Griffin. Yeah, we have such a tight schedule, so I'm very sorry that we might end up with some not having the chance to ask questions. We'll just move on straight away to just get a bit back on schedule. With our next speaker from the University of Tromsø, we have Associate Professor Dina Abdel Fattah, and please make your way to the stage, and she will give you a talk about the future of Northern Norway's agriculture as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Great. Well, that was a perfect beginning from Griffin Hill, because this is going to be a bit of a different perspective, but on the same topic. So I think Griffin did a great job of setting the stage about the big picture, and I will take a little bit of a deeper dive on here in the north of Norway. So my name is Dina Abdel Fattah. I'm an associate professor here at UIT. I'm also the research group leader of our research group on climate change adaptation. So it's a very big topic, and what we're really trying to focus on in my group and also in this kind of work is to say, what can we do with what we know about what's happening? And for a very important local topic that we have, which is, aquaculture, sustainability, our oceans in the future, what is it that we can do from a science perspective, and how can we match that up with business innovations to create a future that is truly, unique to where we are here in the Arctic? I'm just going to shift a little bit so I'm not, Can you still hear me okay? Great. So to take kind of a backstage of why look at the oceans and why the Arctic and why now? And it goes without saying that we have seen time and time again in research after research that's focusing that we are seeing transformative and most probably at this point irreversible change to our ocean ecosystems. And that's not only going to change things like the ocean temperature, but it's actually going to change the whole environment of our oceans globally. And this is a huge topic that is now being highlighted at both the global level, national levels, locally. The UN has dedicated the whole next decade on this topic. So clearly there is an interest, there's a demand, there's a thirst for understanding this. And more importantly, how do we actually adapt to it? Because at this point we can't mitigate, we actually have to take a whole new path forward. So this question of what next, knowing what we know, is critical. And it also requires a bit of an open mind, because there's going to be very many different ways that this can go. Some of them may be things we don't want to see, but it may be happening. So we have to also think about what is our role, both as scientists in this process. And importantly, how can we also look at critical areas that are already on this pathway to this new future? So the Arctic, therefore, is one of these areas. And I think that's also why we're taking this extreme kind of hyper-local focus in this research, because we know it's already underway in the area that we live in. And Norway's aquaculture presents obviously an interesting science question. We know for a fact also that we are one of the most vulnerable to this climate change-induced ocean transformation. And also the aquaculture system here is really kind of one of the reasons why it's a big area of focus. And it's not just from, of course, the scientific knowledge that we understand and the interest in the topic, but it's also on the impact, sustainability on the community as well too. So we have here the largest part, arguably, of Norway's fishing industry and also aquaculture industry. Over 40% of the Norwegian aquaculture is produced here in the north. And that's also a huge global impact because Norway, for the large part, is one of the leading producers of farmed salmon in the world. So even though we may feel we're a bit remote here, we actually have a huge global impact in what we're producing or not producing potentially in the future. And beyond that, it's actually a huge local demand as well too, because this provides food to our area. People here who live in the north, myself included, we eat a lot of fish that comes from the waters around us. So what happens in the future then if this resource goes deplete or gets affected in a way that can't sustain that kind of local demand? And also the jobs. What about the economy, the local economy? What about the future, our education? UIT, for example, has a big focus on this topic. But in the years to come, what if we can't educate people on something if there's no local demand for it? So there's a lot of societal impacts that require a focus too. So looking beyond then kind of the demand, both globally, nationally, and locally, Harstad Narvik, this area, is kind of the key focused area of our research. It's one of the top aquaculture producers in northern Norway, and there's actually a lot of plans in the years to come to get bigger. So despite what we know or seemingly know about the future then of the oceans in this area, we still plan to use them for aquaculture and moving forward. So that's a big business risk, to know that, okay, we know things are going to change, but we're still moving forward. So how do businesses then take that into account? And that's the main question we're trying to drive at. What information are they using? And we also know for a fact that there is little in-depth research being done. As we saw from Griffin's presentation, which I think really highlighted it, there's a lot of data gaps right now. So moving forward, what are people going to use if there's not enough data to make those decisions at the here and now? So this really requires knowledge, scientific knowledge, and it also requires persuasion. It means to sit down with businesses to understand how do they assess risk, and moving forward, how are they going to take those actions if they need to. So to sum up what we know now, we don't know a lot. There is actually a lack of research capacity at a lot of fish farms as well to take this kind of research within their own belts. And it's not because they don't want to, but most of the fish farms, especially here in the north, are small to medium size at best. So they don't actually have the manpower and woman power or the capacity to do this in-house. And there's also a bit of a gap between the communication between science and businesses. So we see that there is definitely a need for this. There is a demand for it, but there is a bit of lack of resources to move forward. So this then brings in the need for science and aquaculture to work together. A research need exists to investigate the various risks, as well as working along industry partners to understand what are the risk treatment options that they can undertake. So this then really requires kind of this innovative pathway between making sure that there's easily accessible and comprehensive long-term analyses that look at the whole picture, but also to know that when it comes down to a business scale, how do people implement that and how do they look at that from different angles? So what does that mean then for my work and for my group's work? We actually have coming up now a PhD position that will be working on doing this modeling work on this hyper-local scale to look at what are the various different possible climate change scenarios that the oceans can face. How would that impact then the fish community, whether it's both farmed or not farmed, so salmon or cod, for example, which is wildly caught. And more importantly, how do we work then with local businesses to make sure that they get this information? So we have an open application. It's open until February 28th. If you know people that are fitting this profile, we would love to have them a part of the group, and we'll keep in touch for the next Arctic Frontiers. Thank you very much. No time for questions? Yeah.
Microphone's working, now it is. I'm very sorry that we can't answer questions right now because we were started late. For sure we're going to have a lot of time for questions in the final part as well, where we have a panel debate, going to involve the audience as well. And of course we have all the coffee breaks in between and so on. But right now I think we'll just move on with Niels Martin from Aarhus University. And he's going to give us a bit of a terrestrial perspective on things right now. The floor is yours, Niels.
Thank you, Igor. So what do I do? Huh? Do something. Anyways, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Igor. So I will present a little bit about what we have done in Sackenberg in Northeast Greenland to provide some of these baseline data we really need to understand impacts of climate change, because we witness and document the actual impact of climate change in the Arctic. So sorry, I'm not used to this. To those of you who don't know, Sackenberg is located in Northeast Greenland at 74 degrees north. It's a small research station. It's also home to a ecosystem-based monitoring program founded by these guys back in the early 90s. And I guess this is actually one of the keys to the success of the ecosystem-based monitoring in Sackenberg, because this is bottom-up driven. These guys defined the program and had it run for now 25 years, and the ambition, as you can see, was actually 50 years. So we're halfway through. So what they did was to break down the ecosystem into these compartments and had a monitoring program running each and every separate silo of these, while making sure that every unit or every metric we measure is relevant to the other part of this ecosystem monitoring program. We focus mainly on the ice-free part of Greenland, which is from the inland ice sheet onto the coastal waters. And we do that in 3 different sites in Greenland. And the concept we had was try to integrate monitoring and research very tightly from the beginning, which means that we have a core monitoring program that will provide data that will enable us to understand or see patterns, whereas all the processes are unraveled through tightly linked research projects. And that is synthesized in research literature, but also in reports and deliverables to stakeholders. And that synthesis goes back into the scientific community, into the stakeholder community, and feeds back into our system. So we have a loop, making sure that we provide relevant information. As an example, I need to show you this. First of all, this is the methane fluxes. We saw in our monitoring data that we have a huge burst of methane one year that we didn't understand why. This is the first figure. We had ideas about this, how this would work. We went back into our monitoring data to see if we can find patterns that would resemble this mechanism. And then we designed a specific experiment to actually validate that this was the case. So this is why the integration of research and monitoring is so important. When it comes to biodiversity monitoring, we have 2 different approaches. I call them mapping and modeling. The mapping part is quite easy. It's counting the same species every year, making sure that we understand who are actually there, how do they interact. And the modeling is about developing mechanistic models that enable us to predict into the future, very much like we heard before. So the mapping part is relatively easy, but it's not. This is actually a real sort of trophic interaction surrounding one specific plant species in the high Arctic, so it's quite complex. But it's a question about tracking all the different species from year to year. How do they vary, and how does the interaction vary? The modeling part is slightly different. It's about taking models and making sure you run them based on, or parameterize them on existing data from the local community that will enable you to predict, say, population dynamics in this case. The aim, of course, is to take all these empirical data and make them end up in decision-making at the stakeholder level. And if you first take this, the mapping principle, we build conceptual models. How are ecosystems structured and how do all these different species interact? That would tell us also something if we do it over and over again about status and trends, of course. And then we can make these expert-based qualitative predictions about what will happen if this and that. And that can feed into the decision-maker level. The mechanistic models are, of course, different. They're very much based on these mapping exercises and conceptual models we do. But based on those, we can actually make these quantitative predictions that we will feed into the decision-maker level. And for the Arctic, and when it comes to biodiversity, this is very much linked to what we do in CBMP. So one thing, of course, is about spatial representativeness. And I showed you this before. We have 3 different sites in Greenland. So you could argue that we know everything about almost nothing. We know 3 valleys in Greenland. But I still argue that in order to do all these fancy model exercises, we need to understand what goes on the ground. Who are the key players? How do they interact? How are they impacted by climate change? And once we know that, we can start using remote sensing to scale up, and we can use remote sensing and modeling to scale up. Representativeness is, of course, key, but fewer people care about temporal representativeness. And this is just to show you, this is just a random trend line. It's a negative trend. We've been there in Greenland for 25 years. Had we only been there for, say, 4 years, we would actually see a positive trend. This is a rather naive graph, but it just stressed my point that it is truly important to maintain these core time series. The same goes for extreme events. This could be seen as just interannual variability, but it's actually an extreme event. Adaptive monitoring, we need to stay sharp here. So what we have done is, of course, we publish a lot of paper based on this sort of approach we have. We have repeated evaluations both internally and externally. We build strategies together with data clients. Data clients are key here. Who want the information we will provide? And then it stopped working. Nope. And then, of course, we work with these international programs, and that's where standardization versus harmonization becomes relevant, because I think we should not focus so much on standards here. We should focus on extracting comparable information across different methods that will enable us to actually utilize all the data that is actually out there already. This looks very much like the Lindenmayer and Likens approach for adaptive monitoring, but people tend to forget there's actually another one out there, which is maintaining core time series. And I think that is key to long-term monitoring, maintaining these core time series. So I guess we should be fixed and flexible at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Niels. That was really good. Again, also apologize here for that we take questions later on. We're getting better back on schedule, so thanks so much, Niels. And for the same specialty, the same university, we also have Floris van Beest. And he's going to talk about the extreme events as I understood it. So, floor is yours, Floris.
No. There, thank you, Igor. Yes, so the next 8 minutes I'm going to be talking about extreme events impacts on Arctic biota. And these little silhouettes you see here means that I'm mainly focusing on the terrestrial system and also a little bit on freshwater systems in the Arctic. So I was going to start with the elephant in the room, but I don't think it's an elephant anymore. We all know that the Arctic is changing. Climate change is a big component here, and there's even a study last year that suggests that the Arctic has been warming 4 times faster than anywhere else in the globe. It doesn't really matter if it's 2, 3, 4 times faster. It's pretty obvious that the Arctic is changing, and very rapidly. So when we talk about climate change, we are also talking about extreme weather events, or climate events as they're sometimes referred to. When the Arctic is warming up, there's also an increasing likelihood of experiencing extreme events, and it has been argued that the Arctic is ground zero for extreme events. Now, when you go online, there's these databases where people actually record extreme events, and you can see there are quite a lot in different types all over the world. But when we highlight the Arctic here, there's very few, which I thought was funny. I mean, why are we ground zero for extreme events if there are hardly any there? So we decided to do a little mini review. We went on to Web of Science and just hit in very simple keywords. Extreme event, which is the sort of pinkish line here. And you can see there's quite a lot of work done on extreme events on a global scale. Really picked up in the 90s. Note the logarithmic scale on the y-axis there. So there's a lot of research done on extreme events, definitely. But if we then type in extreme event and Arctic, it already becomes way, way less. It also kind of picked up from or it actually started in the 1990s, and is growing quite substantially. But if we look at the Arctic extreme events and terrestrial or freshwater systems, this is the blue line here, that has really not picked up at all. So we're clearly not, either there are no extreme events in the terrestrial system, or we're not documenting them very well. So that is what we did. We did a little mini review of this and found 48 studies that have actually dealt with extreme events. And here I just plot the location of them. The first thing you'll notice is that, yes, there are more than on the previous database I showed you, but there are also kind of a geographic bias into where these studies are done. So what sort of extreme events did we encounter in the literature? Well, there's wildfires, which is of course an indirect effect of extreme drought. We have floods, which is due to heavy precipitation events. Landslides, also related to precipitation. And perhaps the most studied one is this rain on snow or icing events, where the temperature is just above freezing, it starts to rain, freezes again, creates this whole ice layer on the vegetation. And you can imagine that this blocks off the food for many species in the Arctic system. Another example I want to show you is summer snow, which maybe sounds a bit weird when you're talking about temperature increase, but it's an extreme event, so even in the summer you can get snow. This is the same valley that Niels showed you in the previous presentation, and this is just around the start of the growing season. The winter is over, animals are coming, migratory animals are coming into the area and they want to start feeding. I mean, this is kind of your normal picture around this time of year. But then in 2018, this happened just before there was a big snow dump. It delayed the growing, the growing season by a couple of weeks to months, and it caused a complete reproductive collapse of the system. So this is what extreme events actually can do. Now more to a general summary of the evidence. I mean, we were interested in quantifying the effects of different types of extreme events on the abundance, growth, phenology, reproduction and survival of these different ecosystem compartments, as we call them, but they're basically like groups of species. And then we noted down the method that was used, the direction of the actual impact, was it positive, negative, or even no effect. And then the number of impacts basically refers to the number of species within a different ecosystem component. Now the first thing that comes out is that I already told you there was a geographic bias in research output, but it's also 80% of the studies that we we sort of summarized and reviewed dealt with 5 different types of extreme events. So there seems to be a bias towards certain types of extreme events, and specifically rain on snow is studied quite a bit. Now, if you look at the vertical lines for arthropods and for freshwater biota, or the fish, there's hardly any data there. So either fish or freshwater systems are not impacted by extreme events, or we're simply not looking for it. So there's a clear data or gap in the knowledge there. There's also, and this is a very common thing when you study extreme events, there are divergent effects across different biota and scales, which is fine, but if we want to start doing meta-analysis about the sort of structural effects that extreme events can have on the system, we need more data. Because if you find different effects for just a few studies, you have no idea if that is a normal thing or whether this. Yeah. And the final thing, which doesn't really show up in this figure, is that very few of these studies that we reviewed were looking at the long-term effects of extreme events. So a very dedicated study, short-term period, they found an effect and then left it there. So there was no follow-up, like when did the population recover? What were the up and downstream consequences of a extreme event? So we came up with a few recommendations based on this mini review. First of all, and this keeps being an issue within extreme event research, there is no universal definition for what is an extreme event, and even if an ecological impact is needed. We considered all sorts of studies where there was a qualitative or a quantitative definition, but it would be nice to actually be able to say, yes, this summer snow event was extreme for this area. And of course, the value of long-term monitoring, as Niels previously showed, comes in handy here, because then you can actually look back in time and see, did this event happen in the last 10, 20, 30 years, and was that actually extreme in terms of data distribution? We also think it's perhaps important to move beyond these single impact studies where we're very much focused on a fine spatial scale and we look at what was the effect of this flood on this specific species. Maybe we need to scale up a little bit, and also for this we should harmonize and standardize maybe some of this monitoring that we're doing. And what could be very advantageous is to use these Interact network of research stations, because then we can set up monitoring systems that do the same thing in different places throughout the Arctic, which can create some sort of control impact, a Baki kind of setup. And then ultimately, even though we're still missing quite a bit of data, there is a lot of data and there is a lot of work being done. So we think it's time to maybe start taking these data and put them into these process and mechanistic models, because they can actually be, as we collect more data, they can be refined, and then we can start to see if our predictions were actually correct or not. So I think it's about time we start doing meta-analysis and take this data and try to predict what might happen in the future if there's more and more extreme events occurring. And I'll leave it there. And no time for questions.
Thanks, Floyd. Yeah, that was very good timing. I suggest we really just stick to the presentations because it's such a tight schedule. I'm very sorry about that. That's also a late start. So I think we go on. Thanks so much, Floyd. It's all excellent talks. I feel very bad that we can't accommodate questions. So let's go for our next presenter. It's Nina Mikkelsen. And she's going to present on her work that she's doing at the Marine Institute. Oh, sorry, Institute for Marine Research.
Institute of Marine Research.
So sorry. Floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. We just heard about the impacts of the extreme events. Now we're going to look, I'm going to talk to you about the impacts of the cumulative impacts of the human activities and we're looking at the temporal and spatial trends of these activities. My co-authors are Evert Johannes Mule and Hiroko Sorban. And this work, okay, thank you. This work is part of the Barents Risk Project, where we are looking at the cumulative impacts of human activities, trying to assess that. And my notes are gone. Okay, we're looking at a change in the system where the new areas are becoming available for human activities, and here represented by the fishing, petroleum, and shipping industry. In the Barents Risk Project, sorry, something wrong here, but okay. Oh, my notes are gone. No, okay, well, in an integrated ecosystem assessment, we need to assess the human activities as well. And in the Barents Risk Project, we're looking at these, and as part of this project, we have been collecting data on these activities on a temporal and spatial scale. This is not the correct one. No. Can we change it? No. Sorry. Okay, so then we have to improvise. Okay, so the Barents Risk Project started out looking at the Holzman presentation paper, where they were looking at multiple pressures of human activities. In the upper layer, you have the class 3, which she made for these different pressures. And we are looking at the Barents Sea Management Plan area, which is the red area here. This is gone, okay. So the approach we have been using is time series analysis for the time period from 2017 to 2021. For most of them, it's 60 months. For a few, we have only 48 months. We've been mapping the human activities in the grid cell system with 10 times 10 kilometers. And we have been collecting data from public sources from Global Fishing Watch, EMODNet, and the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate. In the Barents Sea Norwegian sector, we have 2 operating production fields, which is Snøhvit, who started in 2007, and Goliath, who started in 2016. Johan Castberg is the field furthest to the west. It's planned to start up in 2024. And in the upper gray one here is a maybe field. It's called Whistling. It should maybe develop in the future, but the decision for this is postponed. We have 2 stationary data layers in this model, where the pipeline and the communication cable. The cable is going from the northern part of Norway to Svalbard, and it's approximately 1,400 kilometers. The pipeline is going from the Snøhvit field to Melkøya processing plant, and it's 160 kilometers. It also transports CO2 back to the subsea. Wellbores, we have been drilling wellbores in the Norwegian sectors since 1980, and the activity indicator here is the drilling days per month. We are using only the exploration and development wells because we are lacking data on the type of wells called other wells. We don't have the drilling days there for most of the years, but those are usually shallow and only drilled for less than 6 days. We use the data from 2017 for comparison, 16 for the trend. The spatial resolution is the 10 times 10 kilometers, and an activity located within a cell is aggregated at the midpoint. So any activity in the cell from 5 kilometers from the center is aggregated in this point for comparison. And it's given a unique value of ID. We have some focus areas for the next maps that I will show, where you have the red square here is for the cable, where that is present. And we're looking for the overlapping activities between the cable and fishing and shipping. We have the pipeline and the production sites for petroleum, which is in the black small square, and the well bores are in the blue larger square. So here we have the overlapping incidents in the red square for fishing, shipping, and cables in the Barents Sea. In 2017, changing a little bit to 18. Looking at July 2018, we just remind you where we are. The yellow points here are the overlapping incidents of shipping, fishing, and cable at the same month within the same cell. 19, a little bit more in July between the northern and the southern point. And 2020, not very much difference if you're thinking about the COVID incidents here, pandemics. Here are the time series for overlapping with fishing. Time series. Okay, so here we are looking at the number of grid cells. How many grid cells are actually overlapping? It's saying something about the spatial extent of the fishing. It's not overlapping with cable in the 2 points to the right. And it's mostly relevant for the bottom contacting gears. Here is an example for the overlap with the fishing trawler. Same things that you showed before, but this is just the trawlers picked out from the area, not the fishing. It's only trawlers. And you see it's changing also. And it's quite a bit in 2020, close to the coast. Wellbores are also overlapping with fishing in these points. It's also the number of overlapping grid cells. You see it's very seasonal. And trawlers are overlapping more than others, but it's only in 2 grid cells at the most. Here is the monthly overlap. It's colored red for the wellbores when we have trawling in the same area where we have wellbores or in the same grid cell, which can be pretty far from each other anyways, but it's where we are with the spatial resolution now. And these are the most important bottom contacting gears in the Barents Sea. And here are the location of these overlaps. It's only 10 overlaps of these incidents from 2017 to 2020. Also, we did some time series analysis to look for the trends in the different time series. And here is the fishing by vessel categories. And you see also here, it's pretty seasonal. Mind the different y-axis here for each gear. It's important to see that the fishing is way, way larger than anything else. So the trawlers, I mean, sorry. And here are the trends from the time analysis. We have the seasonal component in the model. And you see some are decreasing, the purse seiners are increasing, and the pole and line, pots and traps, and dredge fishing, tuna purse seiners are pretty steady. but these are only for the 48 months. Same done for the shipping data. Also, mind the y-axis is different for the different type of vessels. Here also, the fishing is much larger than anything else, and it really contributes to the total amount. Here's the trend for, sorry, the trends. You see the passenger vessels have been decreasing. That may be due to the COVID pandemics. Some are increasing. But again, these are 60 months. So increasing based on these results pretty fast. Based on these, we need to increase the spatial and temporal resolution when assessing cumulative impacts. This will improve risk assessment in integrated ecosystem assessment. We spotted some candidate areas for hotspots. They have increased risk for cumulative impacts. And the adaptive management for human activities in the Arctic has to include the seasonal variability in both temporal and spatial distribution of the multiple pressures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina, for even giving this talk on the wrong slide deck. I'm so sorry for that. Yeah, we're going to keep the questions until the end for the session then. So I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Is Eiste from the University of Bergen. I'm not going to even pronounce your last name. Feel welcome to the stage. She's going to give a presentation on blue growth projects. So please take it away.
Hello everyone. So my name is Eiste Klimasjov-Skeite. Very complicated actually. I'm from University of Bergen and I'm one of the fellows in the CEAS program there. So I will make this very fast. Hold on to your chairs. We are 5 minutes behind the schedule. I'm skipping this full disclosure, structure and content. I'll just give you a bit of tasting menu of everything what's happening today and a bit of methodology, what is blue growth, and 2 case studies that are tightly connected, I think. So background, what is blue growth? I think these are 2 quite representative quotes, but they are very different. So first one comes from Virginijus Sinkevičius, who is the EU Commissioner for Environment, Ocean and Fisheries. And he says we want this transition to blue economy to be the big next industrial revolution. And big part of the blue growth is also energy transition. So the next quote is quite different and comes from Esther Hoving's thesis. And she wrote a thesis in Blue Humanities, and she says that truly sustainable transition cannot be, tightly connected with these ideologies of this perpetual growth. So I think this gives you a feeling of what's going on a little bit. And why research blue growth? Because it became such a salient topic in international and national agenda. So it's important to ask what is going on and where we are heading to with all of this. And of course, how to research as a qualitative scientist. I'm biased, so of course I will tell you that messy political issues are best studied with qualitative methodology. And what I do mainly is I work with text as data, so there's this a little bit of mess in beginning, and then things are neatly put into themes or topics, and there are patterns similar to quantitative science. Some stuff that I wanted to talk about quality of qualitative research. So there's always some misunderstanding. People think we're just cherry picking and doing stuff. But cherry picking is bad in anything, in qualitative and quantitative science. And if you put cherries into this beautiful pattern, there are still cherries. So no cherry picking here. Cases. I have 2 cases. So one is my own research program. We will be 37 people eventually, and we are expected to contribute to sustainable blue growth. And the other case is deep sea mining in Norway. So some of the people in my program research deep sea mining, including me. CEAS postdoctoral program at UIB is unique that it's a Marie Curie co-fund, and we are fellows scattered through different faculties at UIB, which is a luxury and opportunity to collaborate inter-transdisciplinary approaches. We have a great admin team. We have a great bunch of supervisors across different faculties, mentors in the industry, and we have a bunch of evaluators that I still try to kind of recruit for my research, but didn't succeed yet because they are anonymous, so I'm like having intermediary with the admin. And so what I will present next is just these like kind of snaps or tasting menu of my descriptive data. So as I said, from the program, you can see that we're expected to kind of contribute to a sustainable blue growth. So it's a relevant program to study. And YC's program, again, some of my colleagues work in the Arctic. Some of us are interested in deep sea mining. And a lot of what's happening, we have a lot of natural sciences, scientists in the program, but it's incredible how social natural sciences are, and from co-writing proposals to being put on cruise vessels where people spend 24 hours a day together and struggle or have fun. Everything what happens there behind the scenes is very relevant, and this is how blue growth happens. It's happening there behind the scenes, so I thought that it's very relevant. And some of the questions that I'm interested in is basically, surrounding the topics of knowledge, expertise, transdisciplinarity, and of course, what is this future that we're building? And we'll be 37 experts eventually, as I told you. The second call just ended now, so a big group of people are coming now to UIB. I can skip this. So a bit of tasting of what it means, knowledge of uncertainty. I thought this participant, so I work with work diaries of my colleagues, and I thought that this quote is really amazing because, this person says, a colleague asked last night why I thought uncertainty was in the BP, not CP. It doesn't matter what these things are now. And I sort of wrote off the possibility that CP was wrong because a lot of effort and processing goes into getting BP, and I've seen good match up with CP from another method with beads. And sometimes after our discussion, I came to realization that CP could very well be the issue, and which is sort of a challenge because it also can impact BP by means of the attenuation, correction, and processing. So this tells you like how complex the work behind the scenes is, and I think this reflective diary is exactly what represents a good quality research. This person works in areas of Svalbard, and it's a research. It's a natural science research, and one would think it's like very exact and specific, and people just sit and probably cook up numbers, but it's very social. Another example, talking about code. So this person says, sometimes if you work with code you do not know, sometimes it can feel even wrong, or another person, so I'm not correcting any of these. This is like kind of, copy-paste. So another colleague says, woo, finally finished making a function that works. And next he writes, not sure about the algorithm I'm using though. So there's like, he's learning between R and Python, and he's struggling, and then eventually says, hopefully the computer will not crash. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I find it fascinating. And a bit of power and powerlessness. So one of my colleagues says, I can research these minerals in the deep sea, but I cannot tell you what to do with these. You are the social scientist. You are the policy, person, so you should tell, what to do. And, it shows you tremendous power that a person has as a researcher of a very specific topic. And at the same time, they kind of probably feel powerless because, they feel, well, they are not, policy scientists, so they cannot tell what to do. Transdisciplinarity, there's this incredible entry from one of my colleagues who I never realized, but she says, well, in my field, it's very complicated to share ideas and, to collaborate because the field is very competitive. Which means when this person joined the program, that's combining people from different faculties, they realized that, they can share ideas and they can really productively work with other people because they are from different fields. So suddenly, there's less stress. And I mean, intertransdisciplinarity, this is one of the apparent perks of, working across different faculties. And let's dive straight to the deep sea mining case, so from research desk to the country of Norway. And I thought I will give you some of the explanations what in this map. So this is the area that Norway opened 2 minutes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's basically, this is the area opened, it's in the Arctic front. And again, I'm interested in knowledge, expertise, and some power. So usually this DSM thing is framed as an energy transition thing. So a lot of reports are often used to frame that, we need to control the supply because the demand is growing. And as a social scientist interested in text and all these topics that I mentioned, I thought the most relevant thing is to go to all these impact assessments to look what's the knowledge and expertise is deemed relevant there, what are the potential power relations, what is the future. And then I go to this impact assessment shared last year in October when they opened this area. So it's an economic and social effects assessment. And I mean, eventually I realized that it's only economic effects, no real social effects. I mean, and obviously then experts that are relevant are economists, not, for example, human geographers, not psychologists, not, Similarly, in this case, one of field notes that I have is a scientist saying, well, I'm not against DSM, but decision to open or not, or, to explore or not, should be based on information. So, we scientists are not decision makers, which is, again, it's tremendous position of power and powerlessness. I mean, you research the topic, so you should have the power to talk about it in various ways. And this is from Minerals Conference in Bergen last year, also October. So when they announced the opening of the area, there were some people from the Ministry of Oil and Energy and from the oil directorate. So they came and presented the impact assessments, and you can see some of the stuff concerning expertise, knowledge, and, there's this concept of acceptable damage. I don't know what it means. I never digged out. I read many of these documents and didn't really find what it is. So some of the conclusions, what I think is happening potentially, this move from fundamental science, and we are requiring more applied scientists and science research, and this is kind of sad because fundamental science is still, I think, a base of everything. Demand management suddenly disappearing, and think complexity. I think one of the theoretical ideas in social science about think complexity is what's happening today maybe is quite think complexity, because we are presented with these things that, okay, the impact will be limited, the controlled, acceptable damage, and, if a manganese crust needs over a million, 10 decimeter manganese crust needs over 1 million years to grow. So what does it mean in sustainable development if sustainable development is about, not jeopardizing the future needs of the needs of future generations? So basically just some of the, and slide that no one asked for and beyond time is, credit to ChatGPT, a perfect example of, think complexity. It's very kind of, answer about nothing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Aishi. That was really refreshing and very nice concluding points that you drove home there. We have 2 more talks left in this block of presentations, and they will be joining us remotely from France and from Italy. So the next speaker will be joining us from France digitally. Her name is, I need to refresh my French, Tanguy Sandré. If I'm pronouncing it correct or not, I'm not sure. She's from the University of Paris, and she will be talking about grounding climate change into meaningful local experiences in the Arctic, and including seasonality, sea ice changes, and actually some polar bears as well. So we're just getting this up and running. There we go.
I'm Tanguy Sandré, PhD student at the University Paris-Saclay, and I'm going to present you my research in Itokotormi in Karalit Nunat on local experience of a changing climate. And I will talk about seasonality, sea ice change, and polar bears as emerging risks. First of all, my research question is how caring for local narratives, story from the margins, strengthen the community abilities to shape their own world and to recover from shocks in a respectful way for their culture and for their identity. I'm part of two international projects, the Belmont Forum project Samper Arctic and as well the project Prefer on how non-Western communities are facing local terminal risk and how they make sense of changes. So first of all, my entry point is this global narrative of the Arctic that presents the Arctic as a homogeneous area. And what we can see about this global narrative is that local realities of the Arctic tend to be integrated in a science-based and climate and environmental change-based framework that tend to make invisible local context and local specificities of Arctic communities. So those discourse about global narratives are reproducing historical dominance that people in the Arctic have been facing for many decades. And we also focus a lot about adaptive and resilience capacities of Arctic communities, but we never question what's the cost for the Arctic communities to be resilient. Also, there is a point on this science-based discourse of the Arctic and about the knowledge, climate and environmental knowledge about the Arctic, which is sometimes not fitting what Arctic communities are describing, or it's not salient for the categories the Arctic communities are using. So I choose to focus on local experiences and local stories from Arctic communities in Ittoqqortoormiit on the east coast of Qararit Nunaat. I want to highlight that we need small stories, but stories big enough to make sense and to tell other kind of stories. So my focus is on emerging risks that people express in their narratives, and those risks contain the potentialities to threaten the way of being on the world of Arctic communities and especially Ittoqqortoormiit. So those local experiences are based on my fieldwork, repetitive and iterative fieldworks, and more than 40 interviews with community members. So the first risk that this community is facing is sea ice changes, with this idea that the sea ice extent and thickness is more and more unpredictable for local people. And what we can see in stories from Ittoqqortoormiit is that sea ice is a key character that's featured in many stories that people will tell you spontaneously. So the formation of sea ice is becoming more and more unpredictable. The observations are non-linear, so it's really depending on a year-to-year basis. Also associated to sea ice changes, there is multidimensional changes that include polar bears migrations, local mobility, or hunting practices that are deeply affected by this change in sea ice. As I said, the process is not linear. So, for instance, in fall time, on my first fieldwork, people were expressing that the ice was very late this year. And then when I came back in springtime, people were showing me that the sea ice was still thick, while in the past it was free of ice way earlier. So there is a non-linear process happening with sea ice that we don't see very often when we talk about climate change in the Arctic. The second kind of story is about polar bears, which are really associated to sea ice. With changing sea ice conditions, polar bears are coming closer and closer to the town, it's kind of reshaping the way people are interacting with polar bears. So nowadays is more and more a threat for many peoples to encounter a polar bear. But it's in the same time it's also an attraction, something we want to see. But it really reshape practices and reshape the way the young generation is interacting with polar bear as a threat, rather than that emblematic animal. So nowadays, people are not leaving the town without a rifle and are pretty careful during storm events or extreme weather events about polar bear, and they are preventing their kids to be outside on the night time, for instance. The third kind of story people tell about climate change and changing sea ice is about seasonality. So with a warmer climate and more unpredictable climate, the sea ice takes more time to take the sea. It's the season when the sea ice is melting is really unpredictable and a bit longer. So it means that for people there is long interstices between summertime and wintertime, and those interstices associated with difficulties to navigate on the sea or to use dog sledding or snowmobile on the sea ice, because the quality of ice is affected by this change in seasonality. People express also an attitude of impatience and of lassitude faced to these longer interstitial seasons. As a first conclusion and a preliminary result from my grounding experience in ecotomit, people are adapting and are resilient in a way that they kind of follow the flow by accepting their own inability to reduce uncertainties, including by using their traditional knowledge. And my point is that this acceptance is also relative to the history of the community, and for instance to the history of marginalization, with this feeling of being forgotten for many years, also with a limited local agency, with a dependency to Nuuk, which is now the capital of the municipality. And this acceptance is also relative to this optimism that people express towards futures, even if there were projects of closing the town in the past, and if people are talking about how expensive it is to maintain a community on the East Coast, people are still very optimistic. They are also very attached to their place. And finally, this acceptance is also guided by this acceptability also to not know, to be in a situation of uncertainties and to accept it. As a discussion, what my research question is this potential for bridging climate science and local stories and local experience in the Arctic. But first of all, there is a need to heterogenize, decolonize and indigenize climate science in order to be more salient, credible and legitimate for local people. And secondly, there is a need for transdisciplinary science based on local stories to go beyond this narrative of Arctic people as victim heroes, to go beyond science and beyond climate, to develop new narratives of the Arctic that are more salient for local people. Also recognize that us as researchers, we are not in a neutral process of producing knowledge, but we are doing situated knowledge, and we have to recognize that in order to do better. And then we have also to de-westernize a climate narrative, to make space for a plural way of experiencing the world. Thank you so much.
And then we have a final presentation for this morning session, which is going to be joined by Luigi Carlucci from Italy. He's presenting from there, or at least his recording was made there. He's going to present on the trophodynamic indicators for food web structure in the Barents Sea.
Hi, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay. I share my presentation. Okay, do you see my presentation? Yes. Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. I am Luigi Carlucci, a PhD student in polar science at the University of Venice, Italy. And I will present the results of a preliminary and partial analysis of trophodynamic indicators obtained from the cumulative biomass curves for the Barents Sea ecosystem. So first, the cumulative curve of biomass across trophic levels has been proposed as an integrative ecosystem indicator to assess the ecological status. In fact, this indicator combines two important emergent properties of an ecosystem: the energy flow in terms of transfer efficiency and the storage expressed as biomass, which are both useful to detect rapid ecosystem changes. This approach is based on the theoretical background of biomass accumulation that is normally distributed across trophic levels, and transfer efficiency that is limited up in the food chain. From these properties of the cumulative distribution function of biomass, a sigmoidal pattern results when plotting the biomass, the cumulative biomass against trophic level, as you can see here. And it was repeatedly observed that the shape of the cumulative biomass curve, which with a typical S pattern, becomes less steep and move towards lower trophic levels due to perturbations. And whereas ecosystem recovery results in increased steepness and movements towards upper trophic levels. And as these properties can be tracked over time and changes are consistent and predictable, they provide a promising indicator of ecosystem status and responses to external perturbations. So at this purpose, the partial and publicly available data obtained from the annual ecosystem survey in the Barents Sea resulted particularly suitable due to the time extension and spatial distribution. And since the rapid warming trend in this marine ecosystem was observed to induce geographic shifts in biological communities and also changes in the food web structure. The data set used is a partial version, including biomass values obtained from a limited subset of the survey stations in the period 2004-2020, displayed by the points in the map, and was combined with values of trophic levels for each species. Then, based on the community distributions resulted by previous studies, we selected two areas for each community type, the Atlantic, Central, and Arctic type, where the second area in the Central and the Arctic communities change in typology between 2004 and the period after 2012, respectively to Atlantic and Central, as you can see in the map. The geographic coordinates of each survey station were then used to extract data in the 6 areas. And then the biomass data for each area and each year were summed for discrete trophic levels interval in order to calculate the cumulative biomass curves. And lastly, data were fit to the S-shaped curves, and some parameters were calculated using a logistic nonlinear regression model. And these parameters include steepness, which is the slope of the tangent through the inflection point, the trophic level of the inflection point, so the point of change in the slope of the curve projected on the x-axis, and biomass of the inflection point, so the point of change in the slope projected on the y-axis. And in this way, it was possible to identify the temporal trends of the curve parameters for the 6 areas on a yearly basis. So from the plots of the cumulative distribution of biomass against trophic level, we can observe that the area 1 of Atlantic and Central community type showed almost no variation in the curve shape, whereas Arctic type is highly variable, but without a clear pattern. On the contrary, area 2 of Central and particularly Arctic type showed a more consistent curve shape variation, whereas Atlantic type remained stable. Here we can observe the temporal trends of the curve parameters for the different community types, with the 2 areas showed with different colors. And we can see that the biomass and trophic level of the inflection point and also the lower asymptote are quite stable for the Atlantic and Central community type, whereas steepness show slight variations. For the Arctic type, all the parameters are more variable. In particular, the area 2 of Arctic type showed a strong increase in the maximum, showed strong increases in the maximum curve steepness in 2006, 2012, 2015, and 2020, which were actually characterized by high ocean heat content at the end of the summer, and were also associated with strong peaks in fish species density and geographic expansions. The effects of these heat waves are also reflected in some parameters of the other areas. For example, a decrease in the biomass and trophic level of the inflection point in the Central community in 2020, and also an increase in steepness in the Atlantic and Central community in 2015 and 2020. In conclusion, the ability of these simple indicators to catch the difference between community and food web types represents the basis for using the trophodynamic indicators to reconstruct the spatial and temporal dynamics of the ecosystem, and also to test them as quick tools to detect changes at the ecosystem levels. Some aspects need to be further investigated, such as the variability of the curve parameters in the Arctic type areas, which are possibly due to a combination of community properties, such as the number of species, the number of links, and other parameters, and also climate properties such as sea ice extent and duration. And as you can see from the plots, the curve parameters are influenced by species composition. So the integration with the community and food web metrics, as well as anthropogenic stressors such as fishing activity, could provide further explanation of the spatial and temporal variability of the cumulative biomass indicator. And lastly, further analysis, including data covering the entire Barents Sea, could provide a much clearer picture and increase the capability to assess the ecological status of this rapidly changing marine ecosystem. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Luigi. We're quite a bit over time, so I would like to encourage everyone to stretch their legs, grab a coffee, and go and grab a presenter if you have questions for them, because obviously the schedule doesn't really allow to do that. We have to start sharp again at 11, so please be back on time. And just as a last note, the speakers for the next block, if you uploaded last minute, can you go and check if your presentations are the correct ones, please? Okay. Hello, everyone. Let's find a seat and let's get started so we can stay on track. So welcome to this second block of presentations within our session. As you noticed before, this is a little bit of a different format than we scientists are used to. So we apologize if we can't accommodate many questions, but I think the coffee breaks and the lunch break should make up for that. We have the same rule as before. If there's it's going to be about 10 minutes, there's going to be a warning if there's 2 minutes left, so that we can really give everyone proper time and that people don't have to stress because it's a short presentation or so on. So without further delays, let's get going. And we have another keynote speaker to open this block of presentations, which is Louise Kiel Jensen from the Norwegian Polar Institute. And she will give a little keynote talk about going from monitoring to management. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Welcome back for the coffee break. And thank you so much for inviting us to have this keynote speak here. It's called From Monitoring to Management, but it's about the Norwegian Ocean Management System and all about how we could improve this system in both now and in the future. I put together this presentation together with my colleagues Hanne Jonsen and Cecilie von Quillfeldt, and we are from the Norwegian Polar Institute. But it's very important to state already now that this talk is not our work alone. It's work of a lot of different institutions in Norway. So the purpose of the integrated management plans is to provide a framework for value creation through sustainable use of the marine natural resources and ecosystem services, and at the same time maintain the structure, functioning, and productivity and diversity of the ecosystems. A very important step towards making the Norwegian management plans was taken in 2002 with the publication of the white paper Protecting the Riches of the Sea. This was a white paper calling for a change from the sector management into the more ecosystem-based approach to management. It set out tools and how to build up the management plans for people to work on. And working groups started to work on the management plan for the Barents Sea. That was a pilot. And the first management plan we got in 2006. And other groups, and somehow also some of the same people, but made the management plans for the Norwegian Sea and the North Sea and the Skagerrak in 2009 and 2013. There's been various updates of the management plans. We'll come back to how they are updated. And the last update came in 2020. It was then decided to publish the updates and the revisions of the management plans in one plan or one white paper. And it was also decided that all the management plans should be updated every 4th year. We are currently working on updating the knowledge base, which is essential in this talk, for the next management plan, which is due in 2024. So the ecosystem-based ocean management is organized in kind of this way. It's an adaptive management system, and I should use a laser. Yeah. A core feature of the management plan is a knowledge base. So this includes both environmental knowledge, but also sector-based specific knowledge and cross-sectoral assessments of the implications of the activities. These knowledge base feeds into the integrated ocean management plans. The management plans set up frameworks for the activities, it set up goals for the ecosystem, and it also specifies some measures which should be worked on within the next period. These measures is often sector specific and are handled in the different sectors, but they may also be knowledge development and the development of common tools for the whole system. Scientific advice is a very important part of the whole getting the knowledge together, and of course this includes both monitoring, mapping, and research. So as I said, every 4th year we update the management we update the knowledge base as well for the management plans. And we gather the status of the ecosystem. We evaluate what progress has been made towards reaching the goals for the management plan, and we provide scientific advice. And these feeds then into the updates of the management plans and back into the white papers, with maybe new frameworks for activities and new measures. I'll just mention that right now we are working on, or we have just about to finish the updated knowledge base for the next management plan, and it will be out for public commenting within the next week or two. Stakeholder involvement is very important in the whole management system, but I'm not going to come more into that on this talk. The management system is led by an interministerial steering committee, which is led by the Ministry of Climate and the Environment. There's representation of all the ministries with interest in the ocean areas. There's 2 advisory boards. One is the Forum for the Integrated Ocean Management, led by the Norwegian Environment Agency, and the other one is the Advisory Group on Monitoring, led by the Institute of Marine Research. As you see on this slide, there's a lot of different institutions, both directorates and institutes in Norway, which contribute to this work, and they are all equally important. So the management plan, what does a management plan actually contain? Well, it gives a description of the area, of the environmental status, and also of the human activities and other pressures. Also prospects of where we want to go. It puts the Norwegian system into also the international framework, but most importantly, it sets out goals for where we want to go with the management, and also evaluate how far we are in reaching the goals. And it gives these measures or the government's intentions in specific points, saying the government will, and then there's a topic to resolve. The 2 advisory boards has got quite different working areas. The advisory group on monitoring coordinates the monitoring on the marine ecosystem and the monitoring of the human impact. They contribute to developing these monitoring systems and also in developing new assessment tools to evaluate the data they have. They deliver environmental status report based on published indicators, and these indicators are updated regularly and published on this website. The Forum for Integrated Ocean Management has got are asked to give a status of the industry's activity and impacts in the areas, and also value creation. This also includes the ecosystem services from the seas. We may come a little back to that if I have the time. And one very important topic for this forum is to provide the scientific basis for determining the particular, where do we have the particularly valuable and vulnerable areas in the sea areas. They also work on the impact of climate change and the risk and preparedness against acute pollution. The forum has got some, they also evaluate the measures that were put out, the government will points, and they do assessment of where we are in reaching the goals. Very important for all these topics is to point out where we have the research, the knowledge gaps. Knowledge gaps is one of the things that brings us forward. And closing the knowledge gaps, okay, that is what brings us forward. when the first integrated management plan for the Barents Sea was published in 2006 and until we had the update in 2011, there was a huge interest in getting some more information about the seafloor and the seafloor population that was done through the Mariano project, and also on the seabird populations, which were done by the CPOP project. There was also some seismic surveys, and the reason for all these information gathering was, and it was especially in this Lofoten area. And the reason for that was that in the first management plan for the Barents Sea, the Lofoten areas was put out to be one of these particularly valuable and vulnerable areas. But at the same time in Norway, we had an interest in exploring these areas for petroleum. So after this gathering of a lot of information for the next 2 years, or the 5 years, we saw that the position of this particularly valuable and vulnerable area was strengthened. And in the next updated white paper, the petroleum industry were asked to resign from that area. The particularly valuable and vulnerable areas are a very important feature in the management plans. These are areas that are designated as being very important for the biodiversity and the biological production in the entire management plan area. They don't give any restrictions to commercial activities in the area, but it does say that if you do any activity in this area, you should pay attention to the ecosystem, and you should not do any activities that may harm or threaten the area. The area is set based on a series of criteria. It may be that they have high production of some species or the system. It may be that they are important for some endangered or vulnerable species. So there's a range of criteria which is important for determining the areas. Yeah. As I said, it's been an important part for all the management plans, but it was the way of setting the areas was handled a bit different in the different white papers. And when we assessed the knowledge for the 2020 update, we saw that there was a need for streamlining this process. This was also put forward in the next management plan, which was published in 2020, so the update, where the government came out with one of these, the government will points, saying that by 2021 there should be a complete review of the valuable species and habitats and their vulnerability for all the particularly valuable and vulnerable areas identified in the management plans previously. Also, there should be a review whether the areas containing underwater mountains meet the criteria as being a particularly valuable and vulnerable area. This assignment was in the Forum for the Ocean Management. It was their assignment, but the assignment was put on the Institute of Marine Research, who delivered within the next couple of years 2 reports. One of them is on particularly valuable and vulnerable areas in Norwegian seas, so on the environmental values. And the other one is about the vulnerability within these areas. It was decided by the Forum for the Ocean Management that the CBD, so the Convention of Biological Diversity, scientific criteria for ecologically and biologically significant marine areas should be the basis of the work. The Institute of Marine Research gathered a lot of experts and made expert panels. I think there was about a little more than 70 experts in Norway working on evaluating these areas. And they worked on different environmental value groups. So they used the EPSA criteria. And if you remember the slide from before, there was these criteria that we always used. And these EPSA criteria are more or less the same, but they are organized in a more structured way. And when you go through each of your area, you go in and you see, is this area very important for maybe biological production? And what species are important for this? And you should always note what references you use. So this is based on peer-reviewed literature and not just some expert's opinion on it. When you do these exercises, you also use a lot of maps. So you build up your valuable area by saying where are the species of value here. And eventually you will have the limits for a specific area that you may call a valuable and vulnerable area. So what you see here on the left-hand side is the current particularly valuable and vulnerable areas as they are in the management plans today. And on the left side, you see, on the right side, you see the suggestions based on the experts' opinion, evaluation on the EPSA criteria. So their opinion, the evaluation of where these areas should be. Yeah. The marine research, together with some other colleagues also went a little on and evaluated the vulnerability of these areas. So for each of the suggested area from the work before, they put out the question, how vulnerable is the environmental values in this area to various stresses? So they divided, here you see the environmental values, so they divided it into more categories, and they have a series of stresses, which are some known stresses in the sea areas, taken from, for instance, the ICES work and the ODEM work. There's some ranking of the vulnerability of each of the environmental values from, actually we do see in the Barents Sea, we see some positive effects of the stresses, the climate change. But otherwise it's ranked from no stress and up to a high level of, or no vulnerability up to a high vulnerability. And also the confidence is in these evaluations is given based on the method that IPCC is using. Yeah, so just to kind of sum up this on the particularly valuable and vulnerable areas. So now we have a harmonized methods for all the sea areas, which is very valuable. When we come back in 4 years' time and have to do this exercise again, then we have all the data available. And we know that all the evaluations is done on the same basis. So that was a huge step forward. It uses internationally approved method that has been used worldwide now. That method was not available when we first made the management plans in Norway, but it came alongside, and now we use this as well. And we, yeah, as I said, we have all the information gathered. But it's also important to say that the final delimitation of these areas are adopted by the Parliament. So it's not just up to the experts. In this, just to take another example, and not just the particular valuable and vulnerable areas. So also in the gathering the basis for the next management plan, we are working on strengthening the ecosystem services delivery. So we are asked to describe the changes and trends for the ecosystem services in the sea areas. And as today, we don't really have a very good way of telling what are the ecosystem services and what are the, or not, we know what they are, but what is the value of them. So, but we took this work a bit further. Now we had the data from the Eriksen et al. On all the environmental values. So we took this from the Barents, from the Lofoten coastal area, and we used that as our description of the ecosystem. Then we had them here, And then we evaluated which ecosystem services do each of these environmental values provide. And that was fairly easy. That part of the exercise was fairly easy. Then we had some economics looking at what is then the flow of the value into the society again. And that's where we stand now. We didn't get very far on that. We got some monetary value on the fishing, of course, but otherwise we don't. But there'll be a new, I think the next 4 years we'll see the ocean accounting coming up as one method of actually evaluating the ecosystem services. So just some concluding remarks. Yeah, the updated scientific knowledge is the basis for Norway's integrated management plans. There's no doubt about that. But these new methods provide us with new opportunities to see our data in a new way and put them together in new ways. And it's so important that we have these developments all the time. And I see that this adaptive management system really benefits from scientific developments. So I hope we take them in as, as appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louisa. That's excellent to set the tone for this block of presentations. Because of time, and as already announced, we're going to go on straight on to the next presentation. So I would like to invite Liz Jørgensen, I think it is the next one. Yes, to the stage. Hi. So Liz is a senior scientist at the Institute for Marine Research, and she will present on a management tool to evaluate multiple pressures in a rapidly changing high Arctic ecosystem.
Thank you very much.
Yours.
And thank you for inviting me here, or giving me the permission to have this talk. So it's very much based on what we just heard from Louise. And if you will bring up the picture. I will be talking about the Central Arctic Ocean. So that is up in the North Pole area, and very much further away than the area that Louise is talking about. My name is... So my name is Liz Jørgensen. I am a senior scientist. I work at the Institute of Marine Research. I'm also leading a working group in ICES, together with 2 other co-chairs, one for Japan and one for Netherlands. So the co-chair from Japan is Saiichio Saiti, and my Netherlands co-chair is Martine von der something, for you know. So this ICES group is one of very many other ICES groups that is using the integrated ecosystem assessment approach that was explained by Louise. And I really need my picture now. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I will talk about this management tool, which are the integrated ecosystem assessment that we heard a lot about right now. It's used to evaluate the multiple pressure from intensifying human activities. And I just presented my co-authors here from the ICES-PICES-PAIM VG-ICA group, or the working group of the integrated ecosystem assessor of the Central Arctic Ocean. So ICES-PICES-PAIM, what is that? I think you have it, yes. So ICES is the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas. It's an intergovernmental organization with 20 member countries. You have the equivalent in the Pacific Ocean, PICES, also with their 6 member countries. And then we have a group called PAIM, that is one of the working groups within the Arctic Council. They have at least the 8 Arctic countries inside their institutions. So we are having members from all these 3 groups within our VG-ICA group, or in the assessment of the Central Arctic Ocean. And the tool that I will talk about, and which Louise also talked about, is about the integrated ecosystem assessment. Also, Nina had the talk for the Barents Sea very much in detail explaining about the method. So I will just build on that. What you see on this map here is that ICES has developed this tool for very many of the large marine ecosystem within the Atlantic Ocean. And you see the Arctic large marine ecosystem that they have done this tool for. So collecting people from all these institutions makes us to a very rich national group. So we are 13 nations, and we are more than 50 members. And as you see, because we are all around the globe, we need to have morning meetings and afternoon day meetings. So we have to double up for all our meeting days. And the area that we are working in is within this black dotted line. So that black dotted line is including the entire high sea, but is also including the entire large marine ecosystem, which are the red lines up there. What we know about the Central Arctic Ocean is not news, but the ice content or the cover is reducing, and it's doing that very fast. And if we look at that in a geographical distribution, we will see for 2012 and 2020 that the reduction was tremendously high by then. And it is the areas within the Chukchuk Sea, the East Siberian Sea, that has most vast open spaces available by then. And what we also see is that ship traffic is increasing as a total. If you look at the blue area here, or the Siberian Sea, you will see a plus 12.5, so it's quite a lot. But the largest increase is in the Barents Sea, 47.6. So we just have a tiny increase in the Central Arctic Ocean. And if we look at how much ships we are actually talking about here, you will see the high blue sticks here is from the Barents Sea. That's the distance sailed by ships, 4 years. So each of these blue columns are 1 year. So for the Barents Sea, that is way out there, we have quite big numbers. But here for the Kara Sea, the Chukchuk Sea, and so on, and all the way to the Central Arctic Ocean, it's actually quite few ships during 1 year. So in 2020, where we had the maximum number of 23, well, it's not more than 2 ships per month, if you take the mean value, in an area that is as large as the Mediterranean Sea. So it's not very much that we are talking about. But of course, they are not there spread all through the years. They are concentrating in the months where we have least ice. So we have to bear this in mind when we are doing an assessment from that. So what do we know about the Central Arctic Ocean? Well, not so much, but still there are available data out there. So we know from the house garden that has been heavily investigated by the Germans that they see an increasing amount of litter wrapped around sponges. So that's one thing we have to bring with us into the Central Arctic Ocean. But we have to remember about Coriolis force. So this is actually distributed on the shelves, how much does come into the Central Arctic Ocean. We do have some timelines on the zooplankton, thanks to the Germans. I think it is the Russian who has made this. Yeah, mainly, that's true. But not for everything. For example, the polar bear, we don't know how many bears are living permanently at the sea. So we do have some data, and then we have these blank knowledge gaps. So how do we prepare? How do we do this? How do we pull these things together, try to make a very relevant assessment that somebody wants to use? So who is interested? What type of information is needed? And how shall we deliver this scientific advice? So there's a lot of questions that we need to find out. So what we did, we used this tool that we now have heard something about, the integrated ecosystem assessment. Here we have to identify in space and in time where are the ecosystem, how does it varies through the year. We also have to do the same for the human activities and the pressure that is following. We also have to know about the sensitivity of the animals in the Central Arctic Ocean. Remember that they are already stressed by a very changing environment. And then we have to overlap the human activities with the biology and see in time and space, do we have an overlap? And how vulnerable or how strong is this overlap? And this is what we are doing. That means that we have to compile enormous amount of, do I have to point at you? Yeah. Enormous amount of information. For now, we have published, and this is available, a 300 thick report on the ecosystem. So that is, you can download that. And I see now Cecilia will start to rise up. Here we have a lot of maps, and we know in time and space where are they? We are doing the same for human activities and pressure, trying to describe this in time and space, and the report will come. It's not finished yet. What we know something about is from the ASTD database, where the ship are and what type of ships it is. And we also have identified what type of pressure is coming from this ship, and we try to score them, or at least finding out where and when. These vulnerability assessment, what species are vulnerable for what type of pressure, we already can download that from the report that Louise was showing us, because IMR already did that, so we can get a lot of help from there. And then we can start to score, for example, noise coming from a lot of different pressures, which would give also a higher value, and coming up with pictures like this. Immediately very, very confusing, but if you start to look into that the shipping part here has a lot of pressures, and these pressures are mentioned here. For example, noise is coming from a lot of different type of sectors, and then you will see here what does it impact. So do we have a high confidence, low, or no confidence at all in our scoring? This is what we do. This is not from the Central Arctic Ocean, this is just an example. This result will come. And then we will have a very short policy description, and I don't think I'm allowed to do anything more, just having a summary. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. Very impressive of how this big group of people can come together and get such a big knowledge piece together, actually.
Yeah, and it's an open group, so everybody can join. You just have your institution to support you, because we can't help you. You have to come to the money yourself, so contact ISEC and join.
There you go. All right, so let's switch gears and go a bit more terrestrial again. So I'm going to invite Jesper to the stage to talk about adaptive management and monitoring in Svalbard. The floor is yours, Jesper.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Igor. Yeah, my name is Jesper Mosbacher. I'm from the Norwegian Polar Institute, and together with my colleagues, Virve Ravalainen, Eva Fugley, and Åshild Petersen, we are the terrestrial team working with ecosystem monitoring. But before we get into what we're actually doing, I want to kind of set the scene, and Niels was already talking about these things earlier, but if we really want to effectively conserve and manage the Arctic terrestrial ecosystems, we really need a very thorough understanding of all the interactions that are happening, the species that are there, the trends that is happening, how the drivers are changing, and everything in between. And the only way to kind of obtain this kind of knowledge is by having these established long-term ecosystem-based monitoring in places that make sense for us. So Niels was providing some examples from Greenland. When we talk from the Norwegian side and in the terrestrial ecosystems in the high Arctic, we are talking about Svalbard, where the Polar Institute have been doing terrestrial monitoring since the 70s at least. So there's some of the longest time series there. And it's primarily been around Longyearbyen, but also Ny-Ålesund, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So in general, the Polar Institute has been doing these time series for a very long time of some of the key species in the terrestrial ecosystem, but within the last 7 years, there is also now this COAT, or the Climate Ecological Observatory for the Arctic Tundra, which is an adaptive ecosystem monitoring program that have been established for Svalbard and also Low Arctic Norway in Varanger. And it consists of conceptualizing the terrestrial ecosystem into food web modules where you design what are the key species you want to monitor and what do we need to monitor from other species that is interacting or which drivers. And by that, you start modeling different responses. But if you want to know more, please visit the homepage of COAT, because it's not really what I'm going to talk about today. Because what I'm going to talk about is the things that we are now building in Ny-Ålesund, where Niels also mentioned one of the problems with the terrestrial ecosystem monitoring is that we only have a really few examples of having an extensive coverage in the monitoring. And Sagenberg is obviously a prime example of this, but outside of that, there's really few places across the entire Arctic that has really extensive coverage and knowledge on the ecosystem level. So for us, Ny-Ålesund is presenting this unique opportunity to build a really comprehensive ecosystem-based monitoring program. We already have time series from the Polar Institute and these core sites and modules from COAT present in the area. There is really a world-class infrastructure up there. It's an old town, easy access, really good lab facilities. And then it's really a unique hotspot to work out from. And then there's a complete research strategy from Norway and within the Polar Institute as well, that Ny-Ålesund is a place where we need to be and monitor these areas. And when I talk about a unique hotspot, I wanted to show this map. So this is Brøggerhalvøya, where Ny-Ålesund is placed here in the middle. And when you look from the terrestrial point of view, it's really, we are monitoring these areas. There's a really large difference in the vegetation. We have all the key terrestrial species on Svalbard in the area. We have a lot of birds and bird colonies as well in the area that is providing a lot of nutrient inputs and interactions and nutrient transfers. There's really high mountains in the area, so there's big glaciers, there's a lot of runoff, freshwater activity. And then on top of that, we also have the marine environment right outside the doorstep. So there's really a lot of things going on in a very small place. So the vision for us is to kind of build this really comprehensive and extensive and also intensive ecosystem monitoring program, where we want to be present throughout the entire period of activity and do a lot of repeated measurements that is also known from the Greenland ecosystem monitoring program. So it's being built upon these existing time series and the COAT modules that are already there. But what we have been doing for the last few years now is we are building on this. We have been expanding some of the activities that already were there, but then we have also been covering knowledge gaps that we have identified in the area. So now we are including, for example, arthropods, waders, and vegetation phenology in the area. And we're doing this on a very intensive time schedule, so we have weekly sampling throughout the summer period. And then the entire concept also runs on that we want to link everything together in one area. So this is from a more like a site-specific point of view, where we have an insect trap. Then in the same area, very close by, we have the vegetation phenology plots. We also have the weather monitoring. We have some abiotic local climate monitoring in the same places. And then on top of that, we have all the reindeer, the ptarmigan, the vegetation monitoring that is going on in the same area. So from a site-specific place, we have everything kind of linked together. And if you, I don't know why it doesn't go, okay. If you look a little bit more at the regional scale of Brøggerhalvøya, we also have repeated sites throughout the entire peninsula, and we now kind of cover most of this area very intensively, and especially the northern side. We are there daily, and we're performing these weekly measurements of many different species groups. And on the south side as well, we are present multiple times, but less intensive. So also, if you now look at kind of from a food web perspective, from the terrestrial ecosystem, we have monitoring in the area now. I don't know why it's not going. Oh, okay. On the vegetation parts, we have from the ptarmigans, the reindeers, and the Arctic fox. So these are well integrated within the core network as well. And then what we have been building in the last few years, also the climate module is there. So we have weather stations in the area as well. So we have really updated information on everything, abiotic-wise. Now we have included the insects, the shorebirds or the waders. We also have monitoring on carrions. I didn't really mention that. And then in the area in general, there is also the seabird monitoring program that is run through the Norwegian Polar Institute. So we have information on that part of the network. And then the marine ecosystem is also monitored in the same place in the Kongsfjord monitoring. And then the final piece there from the geese is being monitored by one of our collaborators from the University of Groningen. And then on top of this, we now, because we have this really intensive monitoring program, we start to get the phenology of the system and how this changes throughout the years and how the interaction are changing. Like Niels mentioned, this is really the key to understanding change. So with that, I just want to again say that we really do need these long-term ecosystem-based monitoring programs to really observe and document these changes. And I didn't have time to really talk about it, but of course all of these knowledge that we gain from the monitoring part of our work goes into documenting and assessing the ecological status of the system. And just last year we published this large report on, for the first time ever in Norway's history, we did an ecosystem condition assessment of the Arctic ecosystems in Norway. So if you're interested in the results and how Svalbard is doing, please take a look at the report or come find me later. All right, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jesper. Very interesting. It keeps amazing me how you need to bring people together to talk about these big topics. And again, also here we can see a really prime example that it's possible to bring so many people together and do some integrated science. So next up, we're gonna switch gears again, which is really nice. Not so much a science talk or natural science talk, but very importantly, we're gonna talk about governance, which is another aspect of adaptive management. So please, Justina Dalake, come to the podium and the floor is yours. The clicker is lying at the microphone.
Oh, wonderful. So, I think I can manage this. Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Oh, and good morning, or I think we're almost at afternoon, but I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present my research on this very important topic of governance. First, a brief introduction about myself and my perspective. I come to the discussion as a lawyer from the Norwegian Center for the Law of the Sea. That's here in Tromsø, Norway. And I can see maybe some of the eye rolls and whatnot, but I am a reformed lawyer, I can assure you of that, and I've embraced an interdisciplinary approach using Elinor Ostrom's theory of polycentric governance. And Ostrom, if many of you don't know, she was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in economics, and is known for her research on the governance of the commons. And Ostrom's research on the commons focused on the robustness of institutional arrangements and managing common pool resources. Her efforts contributed to the evolving field of socio-ecological systems, or SES studies, and these studies explore the relationship between social actors and institutions within ecosystems. This interdisciplinary field draws in part on the study of robustness. And so while this panel's overall discussion focused primarily on resilience of these ecosystem systems, my focus will in fact be on robustness, which according to Ostrom means that sustainable institutions beget sustainable outcomes. In addition, Ostrom found that an adaptive governance approach aided in realizing sustainable outcomes. So without further ado, let me be a bit of a lawyer and make my case. So essentially, this presentation explores how to connect the marine ecosystems with the institutions tasked with governing the management of them within the Arctic context. And first, I will set the stage by explaining how the ecosystem approach relates to adaptive management, and then I will define adaptive governance and set out its requirements before closing with recommendations on how adaptive governance can be used to support the adaptive management of Arctic marine resources. When talking about adaptive management, or adaptive governance for that matter, in an Arctic context, the point of departure is the ecosystem approach is set out in the Arctic Council's EA guidelines, the definition of which is set out on the above slide. We cannot talk about the ecosystem approach without considering adaptive management. Adaptive management focuses on the ecosystem and how to improve policy implementation in the face of changing circumstances within that ecosystem. So essentially, adaptive management is learning through doing. Because of its focus on the ecosystem, the literature tells us that the ecosystem approach is inextricably linked to adaptive management. In addition, the Convention on Biological Diversity and its framework supports this view, stating that the ecosystem approach requires adaptive management to deal with the complex and dynamic nature of ecosystems and the absence of complete knowledge or understanding of their functioning. But as Ostrom and other scholars have said, in managing ecosystems within very complex and fragmented systems, other governance approaches need to be taken, such as adaptive governance. So what is adaptive governance? The implementation of the ecosystem approach would be incomplete if we focus solely on management without considering governance. First, it's important to understand that management and governance are not the same thing. Governance focuses on formal and informal institutions and simply put determines who can do what to whom and on whose authority. Likewise, adaptive management should be distinguished from adaptive governance. As I just said, while adaptive management focuses on the ecosystem, adaptive governance focuses on how institutional arrangements integrate adaptive management. Adaptive governance is characterized by institutional arrangements that focus on that enable flexibility and responsiveness, and institutions that learn, problem solve, and connect across diverse stakeholders. The institutional focus of adaptive governance makes it uniquely suited for making my case for using adaptive governance in concert with adaptive management in the effective implementation of the ecosystem approach in the Arctic. Ostrom, in considering the robustness of institutions in the diverse commons of ocean fisheries, derived 5 requirements, if met, would result in robust institutions and therefore sustainable outcomes. So first, we need science, and this is, we need updated scientific information for the use and monitoring on a very regular basis. Compliance, there needs to ensure and enhance compliance by the users through monitoring of the resources by the users themselves. And this would be in contrast to having external arrangements or some kind of a top-down approach. Conflicts need to be dealt with quickly, effectively, cost-effectively across multiple levels. And then there need to be internal and external linkages that both increase operational effectiveness within the regime and provide linkages to other regimes, thereby enhancing this coordination. And lastly, institutional arrangements must have the ability to adapt and respond to change. This is either in errors or emergency developments. Now that we've set the stage, let's return back to the management of Arctic marine resources. So the Arctic Council, the Ecosystem Approach Expert Group, developed a set of guidelines for the implementation of the ecosystem approach to the management of Arctic marine ecosystems. In accordance with those guidelines, the following 6 elements, or as I like to call them, actions, are required for the implementation of the ecosystem approach. The first action is to identify the ecosystem. The second is to describe its biological and physical components, and that we must set ecological objectives, assess, value, and manage. Although this is a very helpful list of required actions, who are the actors? In terms of governments, who can do what to whom and on whose authority? How are decisions made on the management of the resources? How are those decisions implemented? How are those decisions reviewed and, if necessary, adjusted? These are the questions that an adaptive governance approach attempts to answer. The expert group has made very significant progress on the implementation of the ecosystem approach. That being said, from an adaptive governance approach, these are the key takeaways from the guidelines. The expert group, they recognize that implementation of the ecosystem approach requires adaptive management, and this is a very good thing. It acknowledges that institutional gaps indeed exist. Again, this is also a good thing. To aid in the implementation, the expert group calls for the institutionalization of an advisory mechanism for the translation of findings on the ecosystems into very clear options for managers, and an inventory of the relevant existing information collected from the monitoring of Arctic LMEs. My recommendations for the implementation of the ecosystem approach, it requires a two-prong approach using both adaptive management and adaptive governance. Regarding adaptive management, further implementation of the ecosystem approach in accordance with the guidelines needs to continue. Regarding adaptive governance, the Arctic Council Working Group and or other expert groups should first conduct a stocktake of existing institutional arrangements. This should include global institutions and bodies, including the future BB&J agreement, amongst others. The stocktake should also include regional and sectoral institutional bodies, including ICES and PICES that we heard from Liz, the International Arctic Science Committee, the Arctic Council and all of its relevant working groups, the Agreement on International Scientific Cooperation, and the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, amongst many, many others. The purpose of the stocktake would be to develop recommendations based on the 5 adaptive governance requirements with the aim of strengthening existing institutions and or developing new ones. From an institutional perspective, in developing these recommendations, specific focus should be given to the 1st and 5th requirements. So regarding science, direct links need to be established to the future BB&J agreement, where the science will be supported by the IOC through a centralized system with a number of regional nodes. Linkages should also be established to the Science Committee and the clearinghouse mechanism that will be established under the future BB&J agreement. Regarding the ability to adapt and respond to change, this essentially requires future-proofing of the institutions. And one good example, again, is the BB&J agreement, where the agreement contemplates how emergency measures can be taken in the event of a natural phenomenon or a human-caused disaster. The BB&J agreement also provides for a decision-making mechanism that would, if consensus cannot be reached, at least a decision could be reached through a voting mechanism. So to close, following these recommendations will enable the implementation of the ecosystem approach, and it will again result in sustainable outcomes. So this concludes my making of the case for the use of adaptive governance in the adaptive management of the Arctic marine resources, and I hope you find it to be a persuasive one. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was refreshing to hear. It's good that we think about these other aspects as well and not stay in our science box the whole time. So hence, I also was very much in favor to have another talk about Arctic governance. This one will be given by Emily Brook. She's come over from Sweden. She's from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and she'll talk about NGO participation in Arctic governance.
Yes. Hi, thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Emily Brook, and I'm, as you mentioned, a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and I'm presenting today on behalf of me and my co-authors, Dr. Nicholas Ulksack and Professor Lisa Delfmuth from Stockholm University. Our paper, this presentation is actually part of our paper that will be published a week from now on February 7th, so if you're interested in the findings or to learn more about our research, please stay tuned for the publication. So our presentation focuses on the involvement of civil society organizations in Arctic governance. As was mentioned today in several presentations, the Arctic is increasingly faced with environmental, geopolitical, geographical challenges that require governance from a range of different stakeholders. A lot of research has been paid to the roles of state cooperation in the Arctic, but not as much on civil society organizations. And we believe that they have key roles to play in governing the Arctic legitimately and effectively. So there are a range of civil society organizations active in the Arctic, but we focus specifically on indigenous people organizations and environmental-based NGOs. Our research focuses mainly on two questions. The first are, what are the roles of NGOs in Arctic governance? So what are the various activities they are connected to? And the second are, what are the legitimacy beliefs of individuals working in civil society organizations, and how this can impact their participation in Arctic governance? So just to begin, I want to briefly explain how we kind of conceptualize Arctic governance in our study. So we see it as a mosaic of institutions and networks governing at the global, regional, and local levels. And we kind of identify three core Arctic institutions because their mandates are focused specifically on the Arctic region. CSOs gain access to these different institutions through different rules, and mostly at the discretion of the Arctic states, who can sometimes, of course, be reluctant to grant them full participation rights. So we see that CSOs are often engaged as observer roles, who can partake in meetings and in working groups and projects, but in a more passive and limited way, as opposed to the Arctic states. So based on a review of existing literature, we wanted to understand what are the different roles CSOs can take in Arctic governance, and why is this important to focus on? What can they bring to the table? Although there are many more, we highlight five in our study that we think were quite important to mention and to single out. So the first is that CSOs monitor regional accountability. We see that CSOs can act as critical watchdogs in the Arctic, providing sources of vigilant monitoring rather than uncritical endorsement of governance institutions. So if they lack trust in an institution or are dissatisfied with its decision-making, they can expose governance failings and encourage institutions to correct mistakes. They can also do this through different strategies. So for example, insider strategies, where CSOs can lobby decision makers from within an institution. In the Arctic Council, for example, we see the permanent participants using naming and shaming strategies to hold state representatives accountable to their regional commitments, but also to gain greater recognition of indigenous rights and the importance of their inclusion. They can also use outsider strategies, so from outside an institution, for example, through protests, through media tactics, but also by organizing side-level events to high-level policy-making conferences. Another role we've seen them take in Arctic governance is to support the implementation of policies. So before agreements are reached, CSOs can encourage states to take agreements. For example, between the 1960s and 80s, we saw indigenous actors mobilizing, protesting against unsustainable energy projects, and also to create greater awareness of their rights. And this led to them increasingly engaging with decision-making processes and to the creation of formal negotiation processes to settle claims between indigenous people and their states. For example, the ILO Convention number 169 on Indigenous and Tribal People, which Norway was the first to ratify, also partly as a result of Sami protests against the Alta Dam, a hydropower dam in Norway. We also see that when agreements are being brokered, CSOs can push for the inclusion of certain aspects and issues in agreements. During the negotiations of the 2017 Polar Code, we saw environmental NGOs pushing for the inclusion of the impacts of commercial fishing, a ban on the combustion and transport of heavy oil, and greater regulation on navigation to protect marine wildlife. And then when agreements are reached, CSOs can also help enforce these decisions and support states. For example, in the BBNJ agreement, I think CSOs are already working with the Arctic Council to see how to enforce it into the Arctic context if it is reached. Another role they take is advocacy. So in the Arctic, CSOs balance both their protection for the Arctic's physical environment, but also their protection for the Arctic's inhabitants. Balancing these two aspects is a core dimension of CSO advocacy in the Arctic. It can create legitimacy and trustworthiness in their brand and in the eyes of their stakeholders. So by balancing these two aspects, the inhabitants and the physical environment, we've seen CSOs push for greater regulation on oil, energy, gas developments, and also demand more stringent environmental standards around these projects. So we've seen CSOs like the WWF, Greenpeace, different actors using media tactics, different ways to create greater awareness, including through, after the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. So these are different roles they've been taking. The fourth, I think that's the fourth, yeah. The fourth role is to support information sharing. So CSOs are important actors in producing information, in distributing information. They also act as conveyors of information across governance layers. So they can help share information from policymakers to local level, and these are critical functions. Also in the Arctic Council, for example, scientists and observers have been largely contributed to the scientific work of the Arctic Council and the biodiversity research. One of the pillar agreements reports is, of course, the 2005 Arctic Climate Impact Assessment Report, which show the importance of paying attention to climate change in the Arctic. And finally, geopolitics. Although this is mostly a state-dominated field, we see that CSOs have taken a role during geopolitical events. They've adopted approaches that disrupt business as usual politics, but they've also raised awareness to the importance of continued cooperation during times of crises. So we explore this further in our research. The second part of our research was on legitimacy, looking at the legitimacy beliefs of CSOs. So legitimacy is a relational attribute which is bestowed onto governance institutions when stakeholders have trust and belief in their ability to govern effectively. We conducted a survey where we sought to interview, to get the views from 100 different respondents in Sweden, from both Swedish state and non-state actors, to understand their legitimacy beliefs and to also assess the differences across sector in Arctic governance. The survey results showed that Swedish stakeholders have moderately strong degrees of legitimacy beliefs in Arctic governance. But when disaggregated across the different sectors, we saw that civil society had the weakest legitimacy beliefs and public administration officials the most. This can link back to their functions as critical watchdogs who vigilantly monitor Arctic governance. And so it kind of matches a bit of the research we found in the first part of our paper. And when comparing different institutions, we found that they have most confidence in the Arctic Council and the least in the World Trade Organization. And that was the results from the different sectors that we that responded to our survey. Sorry, I'm going a little bit quicker just to keep the timing. But so based on the research that we did on the roles that we found them to be playing in Arctic governance and the survey results, we concluded with 4 main recommendations for how to strengthen Arctic governance moving forward and to strengthen the involvement of CSOs. So first is to increase the meaningful involvement of CSOs in all aspects of the main governance institutions. Although they engage in the Arctic Council, we found that this is sometimes passive and limited. So to increase legitimacy of the Arctic Council, it's important to strengthen this participation. The second is to cultivate information flows and build participatory ways to disclose information. As I mentioned, they are important, both producers, but also transfers of information. So that's important to keep cultivating. And then to foster greater consultative roles for CSOs in governance, and of course in a way that satisfies all parties involved. So this is something that has not been researched much, but it is something that could be done moving forward, the roles of CSOs in interacting with geopolitical events impacting the Arctic. And finally, because the survey found that CSOs have the weakest legitimacy beliefs in Arctic governance institutions, we should understand why, where these come from, and how to remedy these and address governance deficits. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. As I mentioned, the paper will be published in a week from now. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaj. Thank you very much, Emily. So we have 3 more talks left, and they are all about adaptive management. As a surprise, we have our next speaker comes from the Nansen and the Bjerknes Center, just to keep it short because they have full long names. I hope I pronounced your name kind of okay. So welcome to the stage, Tsuyoshi Wakamatsu.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So we are a group of the ocean modelers. So the context is quite different, but I hope it's interesting enough. So my name is Tsuyoshi, and then last 3 years, we ocean modelers developed the tools to monitor the tipping points and then self-operating space in the marine ecosystem in the Arctic Ocean under the European project, Comfort. Then quickly we realized that the tools we have developed based on ocean modeling product can be quite interesting tools for this adaptive management of the Arctic Ocean ecosystem too. So so we put the thoughts together during the discussion, and here's our presentation. So, but let me start from my personal connection with the Arctic Ocean. 20 years ago, I was at the shore of the Barrow in Alaska, and my local friend took me to the hunting for the walrus in the summertime. But that tradition is quickly disappearing after 20 years for the obvious reason. Summer ice is gone, and the habitat is missing. Now, when you stand at the shore, you can see that there is an enhanced erosion. So in just 20 years, environment changed completely to the different stage. But that's a local observation. But when you try to see the entire Pan-Arctic, you need another tool to monitor that change. So eco-regionalization is a very popular and then, I believe, effective tools to monitor marine ecosystem environment. And for example, this is the map used under the CBMP. And then even when this is established, at the very first the report, it says exact boundaries may change over time to reflect changing biophysical conditions. And indeed, it's changing. So this is effective, but you have to come up with some different idea to follow this change. And then another consideration we have to think. Those ecoregions are connected to each other. So once we establish ecoregions, then we have to understand how they are impacted each other, from upstream to downstream, the source to the sink. Then all those views we are presenting right now is very static. And that may last for another 10 years or 20 years, but the situation is going to change very quickly in the next 50, 60 years. So this is one of the tools we have developed for monitoring how the ecoregions could be shifted to different state in the next 100 years based on the CMIP6, the future projection model output. So what is you're seeing is that the color is the distinct ecoregions based on the ocean model. And then the time series is the fraction that covers the Arctic Ocean. Starting from the 1950s, the first 80 years is very stable. But around 2030 to 2050, it's quickly changed. And then by the end of our century, it's shifted to totally different ecoregions compositions. And then during the period, the size and location of regions changes continuously. And then, of course, this is a model future, the projection. So you cannot say that this is what is going to happen, but at least we have a way to predict what could be happening in the Arctic Ocean. So next, the connection. So using, again, the ocean model, the product, we realize that the basin-to-basin connection changes constantly. For example, circumpolar drift, that is the main the advection, the stream that connect Arctic Ocean from one the basin to the other basin. Depending on the climate, the condition, that the connection changes very drastically from year to year. And then because of the climate, the system is changing in the Arctic Ocean, this could be the case for the next 100 years too. So we have to monitor that how the connection changing dynamically too. And then next one. So based on the height of the wave and the ice, the coverage, we can predict how much Arctic coastal erosion proceed over times. And this is the one case computed based on this the ocean model, and then ice-coupled ocean model. So the coastal erosion is one of the big sources. It's covered 1/3 of the nutrients input to the Arctic Ocean. And then what we know can be quite the 30%, maybe 50%, 60% in the next 100 years, because the dumping of the nutrient rate is accelerating based on this the model prediction. So combining those knowledge and tools, so our view about ecoregion and then Arctic the ecosystem monitoring system would be very different. So now we have dynamic ecoregions. Now we know the connectivity is very dynamic, and then source, one of the source, the coastal region, is also the dynamic. So we need to put all those three dynamical components to really see what will happen to the Arctic region. So this is a proposal towards the adaptive management. So starting from collect the knowledge on a static view, that will be the base, and then we can optimize and calibrate our model prediction, and then switch gradually to the dynamical management using the ocean model. And of course, ocean model has a lot of space to improve and using those observations. And then we will reach to the, I think, quite a dynamical adaptive management in the end. And then we like to have a connection with the ecosystem management group. We are oceanographer, physical oceanographer, and ocean modeler, but we don't work with those community yet. So please reach us to discuss this exciting new period of dynamic management. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh. It looks like you actually have time for some questions. If someone has them right now, then we can go for it. Yes?
The key question here should be, how do you link management to changing ecosystem regions? Have you any thoughts about that?
Yes, so I said that starting from static, so you have established monitoring variables already. For those,
can you use the microphone?
So you already have established key monitoring variables or parameters for those static ecoregions, for example. Then, after calibrating well, how those ecoregions shift, and then we can monitor the same parameter, but the following. So that's one.
So this is not management. This is monitoring what you talk about now. How do you want to link management institutions to changing Arctic ocean? That is my question.
That's my question too, because we are more like on can offer the tool for the monitoring, but how do I say? But for the management, we have to share idea that those location to monitor and share the resource are actually constantly changing. So you have to agree that once there is a chance, those the resource can be now in the different place where you cannot put your management already. So that's a I think serious discussion we have to do. But I don't have an answer, of course.
I agree. I think there's some discussions to be had here. That's very nice to see them starting here already. But we have to take them later on in the session. We have a whole panel debate. It would be very nice to have it interactive with the audience as well. So let's take that discussion there further.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Yoshi. So our next speaker, we're going to have Jan René Larsen on the stage. Please come to the stage. Hi. He will talk about the Arctic Passion project and how it's a roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems in the Arctic.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this topic. It is about a roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems, and I speak here as a partner of Arctic Passion, but engaged in this talk is also Sandy Starkweather from Colorado University and Mikko Strandorf from the Finland Meteorological Institute.
Oh, you have to aim to the back of the room. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, needless to say, in this context, the changes to the Arctic there are changes and they are unprecedented. And within the work that we're doing, we believe that observations, they inform actions that should face these changes. There is interest at many levels, as I will speak about in a minute, but bringing the many forces and interests together have been impeded, noting that interests are at the global, at the regional and local scale. And the organization that I also work with, SAN, the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, what we have tried to do is to do partnerships and engagements, and the ROADS process is a way of planning integration among many interests within this area. And I'll take an example which we've already heard about, a thing like wildfire. At the local level, you may have an interest in terms of having local preparedness, local networks for observations, local fire brigades, etc. So things like wildfires is always an interest at the local level. But also at the regional level, you could say at the ICES or the Arctic level, you will have networks across such an area that looks at wildfires from a more systemic purpose, noting specific Arctic features of wildfires. And then finally, at the overall and global level, you will have things like the Paris Agreement that are interested in wildfires from, say, emission of particles, emissions from CO2, etc. So it's essentially the same phenomena, but there are interests at very many levels, and they have different perspectives of such a phenomena. And I was happy to hear this discussion about multi-center governance, because that's actually what we are trying to do, to bring these forces together and establish common objectives. Because from the many things you could observe in the Arctic, there's always a need for prioritization, for funding, and how do you do this in a systematic way, and that's what we're trying to offer with our principles. The principles behind the roads is that we first of all take care of indigenous voices. It's very important for us to engage indigenous and local people, and we need to partner with them at equal terms, and there should be funding for their engagement. In the prioritization process, we also believe in benefits, that societal benefits should drive what we're doing, and it should be benefits shared across the levels that I just showed you. And then finally, it's important that we do not try to reinvent or reestablish new mechanisms, new organizations, new institutions. We need to complement and integrate current processes, and we need to understand existing networks at many levels. And then finally, we also know that we cannot do these things of doing systematic organizations, observations in a big bang approach. We need to do this stepwise, and we need to rely on grassroots. This is where the resources are, the funding is, and the interest in the topics. We are working within Arctic Passion, an EU-funded project, but also in a wider context of providing a framework for documentation of these most impactful observables that should be done. And we, as I said, note that at the regional and at the local level, there will be particular interest. It was interesting to see the sea ice example from Greenland, where we saw that sea ice has observations of sea ice, the understanding of sea ice has a very local meaning that has to do with the quality of ice, fishing, transportation, etc. But that's a very local perspective on sea ice. We know that there are also regional interest in sea ice. We know these big surveys of understanding. We've seen many maps of the extent of the sea ice over the Arctic area. So we also know that there's a particular regional perspective on sea ice. And finally, we know that within the big global programs like WMO and GEOS, sea ice is an important parameter when you want to study global climate change at the global level, models, etc. So we have come up with this idea of shared Arctic variables, those variables that can be shared, has a shared interest among these many levels. It could be that their implementation, the observables are different at the levels, but they are tying together these very different levels that we want to work with. And there are some articles here to look at. We have started working on a few sets, and as I said, Arctic Passion is one of these, where we, under an EU-funded project, have started looking at permafrost. And the idea is that these observables should not just be observations as such, they should always have some kind of product, some kind of service that has a societal benefit. And in this case, and within Arctic Passion, the permafrost observables is linked to a thinking on living on frozen ground. They want to develop a so-called requirements-driven service. Another shared Arctic variable is wildfire, and that again is linked to a particular service, a particular web facility where you can go and understand risks and preparedness when it comes to wildfires. And finally, sea ice as a Canadian initiative. There are institutions there working on understanding better, especially sea ice outlook when it comes to the risk for shipping, etc. We are happy to see also that under this umbrella framework, we also managed to establish some US interest in this, and there is currently a food security project going on in the covering the Pacific Arctic region. A bit about the mechanism. We have a three-step process where we first of all, in a grassroots situation, we want to encourage grassroots to develop and identify their proposals for shared Arctic variables, and within an advisory process that we've established, we make an assessment of these, followed by the development, and finally a implementation process. And for the examples that I just showed you, we are in a lucky process that the food security process is already engaged in this process. For the sea ice project, we already also have established several steps in this process. And finally, for the wildfire shared Arctic variable, we also have developed serious steps in this. But this is still in the beginning. If you're interested in this process, i.e. the idea of developing processes, Arctic variables across many different sectors, we have some readings here to do, but you can also contact either Sandy Starkweather from NOAA or myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan-Jene. I think we have time for questions. Yeah, okay. It's important to wait for the microphone for the people online.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this amazing session. I think it was very comprehensive and ticked a lot of boxes. I really want to address the elephant in the room, I think, today, that is about the oceans and deep sea mining in particular. As you know, Norway has found substantial amounts of minerals on the seabed of the Barents Shelf and is considering whether or not to open these offshore areas to deep sea mining. Yesterday we learned that Kjell Inge Røkke, who is the head of Aker BP, a Norwegian oil exploitation company that was just appointed as a special emissary by the UN Oceans Decade to unlock industrial ocean data on the Barents Shelf. So this has sparked great concern by the scientific community, but also by environmental organizations, calling Norway to postpone its seabed mineral exploration until more studies are conducted. So my question is pretty simple. What is your take on this, especially to the first two speakers? Do you think that the integrated management plan is the answer to preserve the ocean from further industrial harm? Is adaptive management a solution? When here we cannot really learn by doing without harming the environment further. So will it be possible to prevent the negative consequences of deep sea mining? Thank you.
That's a very comprehensive question. And I don't know if there's an easy answer for that.
And I'm not sure it was really directed to me or some of the other speakers.
I think it's an excellent question.
Yeah.
Can we keep it again for the last block of presentations, where we have the panel debate and where we can have a whole room discussion on things as well? Because we still have one presentation to go through as well, and then we can round that up. But please, I'm sorry that you have to do it again, the whole question, but it would be nice if you come back to it in the last part of the presentations. But thank you for your interest. That's really nice to get this kind of discussions going. So with that, I'm going to announce the last presenter for this block of presentations, is Raoul Primiserio from University of Tromsø, who is going to give his take on adaptive management of high Nord systems, especially with cumulative risk in mind.
Thank you, Igor. Yes, we'll look just briefly on some of the challenges to cumulative risk management. And then following that, we'll see what progress we made with advised products, essentially integrated risk assessments. Some of them have been presented earlier on today in this session. And we'll actually have a critical evaluation of those to see whether they can help improve adaptive management of cumulative risk. And finally, we'll see that in that climate-driven change and reorganization of ecosystems we have been witnessing through the talk of the previous speaker, we need to address beyond the specifics of risk assessment, the cumulative pathways of the different hazards. We need to look into systemic risk, so whole system properties that affect the whole ecosystem risk to multiple stresses. Now, much of the research and work on cumulative risk has been motivated and promoted by ambitious legislation, environmental legislation in the last 2-3 decades. And when we look at the progress made, thanks to that legislation, often the type of assessment will look like something like this. Targets of legislation have not been met by a given date or a given deadline. And so the question is whether that is due to overambitious legislation on the one hand, or there are challenges to this cumulative risk management that we're struggling with and that are slowing progress with the issue. Now, for our part as scientists, we of course see the benefits of having challenges with progress because we can motivate our projects. Some of them are listed below. So these are projects that address cumulative risk in general. Now, the type of challenges that we identify, some of them have been mentioned earlier on today, lack of data, for example. We will see today that lack of theory and understanding is another big challenge that we need to address. But there are governance challenges as well. For example, for the integrated type of management we need to deal with cumulative risk, unfortunately, we experience a fragmented governance at the moment that needs to be improved, to be integrated, to become more participatory, in which stakeholders, industry, decision makers, scientists can meet, and civil society, as was mentioned earlier on today. So the governance challenges are one big part of the answer for the slow progress that we experience. The other is the scientific specialization. It's a form of fragmentation as well, that doesn't help integrative approaches. Now, integrated and participatory ocean and water governance is now being planned. 2030, I think, is one deadline again. But while we wait, we need to move on with our project. And these are typically very similar. So when addressing cumulative risk, a research program or research project would have to assess, explain, and predict cumulative risk. We have seen examples of that earlier on today. And then we need to address the management implications. And those are difficult, and we'll see some of the advice products that I just mentioned that can be used by management, what the limitations are, and why they need to be improved. Now, many of the cumulative risk type of project or research projects need to cope with multiple anthropogenic stresses that are often quite similar across systems, whether freshwater, terrestrial, or marine, and climate change and pollution we heard, and habitat degradation, harvesting, biological introductions, and so forth. There's a long list of main threats to biodiversity and ecosystem that we need to cope with, independent of the system we're studying. And so it's surprising that there is so little harmonization in the approaches to multiple stresses research nowadays, and to management of cumulative risk. Now, what we have learned during the last 3 decades of research on cumulative risk is that when we look into the possible impact of multiple stressors, it's not sufficient to focus on those blue arrows on the diagram behind me, in which you see the direct effects of different stresses, different human activities. We also need to look into the indirect effects that are mediated through the network of interactions, those ecological relationships that are out there in the ecosystem, those black lines that connect the nodes, those circles in the diagram. And those indirect effects, we learn, often are the source of interactions between stresses. So we look at not only additive effects on the ecosystems, but also multiplicative or interactive effects mediated by food webs or ecological relationships in general. Now, this specific combination of stressors, fisheries, shipping, and climate warming will be addressed later on today in greater detail during a side event at 3:30 that is moderated by Terry Susser, who is here with us and will help us find the way to the side event. But we're now touching only on general issues. And so one important issue we heard today relates to the effects of climate change. So climate, we heard from the IPCC recent reports that climate and non-climatic risk will interact, as we began to mention, and they will compound overall risk. So these interactions between stresses are a particular concern. The area we are studying, we heard, is a hotspot of climate warming, and this particular region of the Barents Sea and the coastal areas of northern Norway are experiencing unprecedented change that reorganizes ecosystems, so essentially rewires that black, you remember the black lines that are connecting species and ecosystem components, and that rewiring changes the dynamics or the behavior of ecosystems and changes the vulnerability of ecosystems to cumulative pressures. Now, just a brief overview of what type of ecosystem changes we see with warming. Rapid warming in the Barents Sea area, for example, and rapid sea ice loss have resulted in redistribution of species within the Barents Sea that modify not only the state of the ecosystem, so one component of ecosystem health, but also the functioning of the ecosystem and the vulnerability. So much of our work in the last decade has been to try to translate and find obtain insights into how climate change is modifying functioning and vulnerability, so ecosystem health, beyond just changes in the states of what species we find where. Now, redistribution of species also mean changes in exposure to existing stressors, existing human activities in an area, and that also needs to be taken into account. So one approach, one semi-quantitative and relatively simple approach to ecosystem function is to look at functional traits. And here we have an example with André Ferner. André showed here how the functional diversity and the functional characterization of Barents Sea changes as species move north. So we see a sort of the northeast Arctic becomes darker green. Functional diversity increases because new functional traits, new ecosystem functions are entering the Barents Sea. That influences systemic risk, like we mentioned in the opening. Beyond that, feeding links, new feeding links are also moving in with the species. So the redistribution, poleward distribution of species driven by climate warming rewires food webs and modifies properties of food webs that are directly affecting robustness. So ecosystem robustness, food web robustness. And these are properties like connectance, the modularity of food webs, the nestedness of food webs. We're looking to those and we see the rapid change in all those properties. Now, the same type of changes we see in the open sea, we see along the coast of Norway. Here, rapid warming has brought a redistribution of species, the poleward redistribution of species moving into the northernmost regions of coastal Norway. And that change in biodiversity and in ecosystem organization, again, challenges cumulative risk management. So back to our assessments, integrated cumulative risk assessment should, beyond direct effects, should also address indirect effects and interactions between stressors. What is the reality today of the advice products produced, for example, that were mentioned for the Barents Sea earlier on today, or for the Arctic Ocean? The limitations of those approaches is that they focus on direct additive effects of multiple stressors. For example, the ODEM approach that was mentioned used within ICES for ecosystem overviews and for the vulnerable and valuable areas for the Barents Sea. And essentially have an approach that focuses on hazards, exposure, and vulnerability of species without looking at interactions, so food web properties. Now, they generate impact pathways. These have been illustrated by Liz a few minutes ago. So just to show the intricacy of those direct effects, they're not sufficient to inform advice. So we need to move beyond, and we just propose simple, qualitative, and semi-quantitative approaches that account for systemic risk as well. Now, to conclude, the cumulative risk then assessments do not account for indirect effects and interactions, and particularly interactions between stressors often are the source of surprises to management. So they need to be incorporated in our advice products. The rapid climate-driven ecological change that we've seen witnessed in the Barents Sea and documented, that calls for adaptive monitoring that incorporates systemic risk perspective. So we change the system structure, and that influences risk. And finally, there are ways of adaptive, so essentially moving forward with simple qualitative or semi-quantitative approaches that can inform integrated management by incorporating this changing systemic risk in the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raoul. Without further ado, I want to thank all the speakers for this very interesting block of presentations, and please all go and have some nice lunch and get some energy and fresh air. We'll reconvene at 1:30 here for the final part. So see you then.
Welcome to the 2023 Arctic Frontiers Conference. My name is Andreas Raspotnik, and I'm your host. Today, tomorrow, actually you have to bear with me until Thursday. And yes, they forced me to do this first intro statement from the outside. Over the next few days, we are serving you a valuable, insightful, and first and foremost, interactive Arctic Frontiers experience. So I hope you will join us in moving north, true to this year's Arctic Frontiers Conference themes. Welcome to the Edge, welcome to Tromsø. I assume you're all already familiar with our conference program and our well-beloved conference platform. But in case you're not, here are some important reminders. First, where to find the conference program. For a detailed overview, please visit our website at arcticfrontiers.com, click at the conference on the right side of the front page, and simply scroll through the conference program. We have already listened to a number of science sessions about plastic pollution, adaptive management of ecosystems, and occupational health and safety. But don't worry, we still have many more science sessions to come, including city transformation, maritime challenges, and the impact of Atlantification of the Arctic Ocean. Plus, plenty of side events organized by our friends and partners throughout the week. So plenty to watch, plenty to follow, and plenty to learn at this year's Arctic Frontiers Conference. Also, do not forget, everyone who attends the conference in person here in Tromsø has access to our digital platform. So you can rewatch all the science and big picture sessions, as well as some side events from the comfort of your studio, of your office, or your home, whatever you prefer in the next few days and weeks. Second, more science and more fun to come. Today is packed full of science, including a poster session, which will start at 5:30 at the Fram Center, only a few minutes from here. This will be followed by a science reception, hosted by the Norwegian Polar Institute. If you have signed up for this, you should have already received a confirmation email. We are now at full capacity at this event, but there are plenty more social events and networking events throughout this week, including the now famous Pecha Kucha science storytelling on Tuesday, and of course our big main reception on Wednesday. If you're joining us digital, don't worry, you can still participate in a poster session, as we have a digital one on Wednesday starting at 5:30. So make sure to upload your poster by then. Third, taking care of our audience. If you are with us in person here in Tromsø, I also do have some important announcements regarding health and safety. Emergency exits do exist at the very entrance of the hotel just behind me, or behind the stage in the very room you're currently sitting in. And of course at the right side of the hotel, where we also have some conference rooms. And if you hear the fire bell, please evacuate as soon as possible, hopefully immediately, as there were no tests planned. And finally, do not forget to share your thoughts. Follow our sessions and spread the Arctic word. Please do tweet, share, and like. And always use this year's Arctic Frontiers Conference hashtags, which are #MovingNorth and #AF2023. Personally, I'm still waiting for #WeLoveTheHost to trend, but I guess the final chapter of this very story is still has to be written. For now, it's lunchtime. If you bought a lunch ticket, lunch is served as always at the breakfast area on the first floor of the hotel. If you're looking for other options, there's a map in the foyer with the locations of various restaurants just around the corner. Please check them out throughout the week. They serve delicious Norwegian food. But for now, enjoy lunch and see you around.